capitalism they fiercely assail. In every speech it's the villain they unveil. From racism, patriarchy they rail. Ain't known, ain't nothing yet. Where you live, where you fail. Ushering in the Marxist utopias, the end game. The turmoil and strife they aim to overthrow the old. Establish their claim. In the vision they abolish everything. They need capitalism for the pain of clever life. These are the four goals of the woke. Embedded in actions, words they evoke. From pushing and playing Marxist dreams in the dance of power, scheme and scheme. In every move, search and the dreams. Remember, nothing's ever as it seems. So, instrumental. Gain power, stabilize, bring capitalism into the Marxist utopia. That's what they want, that's what they want. Abolish capitalism. These are the four goals of the woke. Embedded in actions, words they invoke. From pushing and playing Marxist dreams in the dance of power, scheme and scheme. In every move, search and the themes. Remember, nothing's ever as it seems. So,
What up, everyone? Happy Friday. We did it. We made it through another week, and now we're going to torture ourselves for a couple hours. But we have alcohol, and so it makes it okay. And today, I'm going to be honest, guys. Today, I definitely need a little bit of alcohol. Does anyone else need alcohol? Anyone else feeling it? Conservatives woke up and chose violence today. And did anyone happen to see the struggle session of Kyle Rittenhouse, where Kyle Rittenhouse made this video saying, "I'm not voting for Trump because I don't like his gun policies, and I'm going to write in Ron Paul because I'm a single issue voter, and that's what I'm going to do." And conservative influencers responded by struggle sessioning him, by blocking him, by canceling him, by literally wishing that he had been sentenced to life in prison. I'm not making this up. You can find it on my Twitter feed. They literally wished that they had never supported him at all and that he had been sentenced to life in prison, because God knows the principle is not actually what conservatives care about. The principle doesn't mean anything to them at all. They just care about tribalism and forcing everyone to see the world in their way. And I have to say, fuck them, is how I feel about this. You know, people say, well, Carlin, you've been shitting on conservatives for years. And yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I have literally made shitting on conservatives into an art form. However, it turns out that everything that I've been saying since the beginning of 2021 has been proven correct. I just saw it much sooner than a lot of other people did. I saw the descent into leftist insanity that the right started the minute that Joe Biden got into office. And maybe it's because I came from the left, and maybe it's because I left the left for exactly the same reasons as I'm now shitting on conservatives, because I saw like my own party basically start self-immolating and canceling each other over words and things that they didn't agree with. And I was like, no, this sucks. I don't want any part of this. And then I saw the conservative right to start do the same thing. And it started slowly at first. And I was like, don't do it. And they kept going. And I was like, don't do it. They're like, but the left does. I was like, don't fucking do it. And then over the past several years, it's just gotten worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And to honestly see people today wishing that Kyle Rittenhouse had gone to prison for the rest of his life because He said that he didn't like Trump's gun policies and he wasn't going to vote for him. They struggle sessioned him so badly that Kyle Rittenhouse has now bent the knee to them and has issued a public statement. No, I'm sorry, conservative. I'm sorry I said words that you didn't like, conservative. I'm sorry. Don't hurt me. Don't hurt me. Don't hurt me. Now, I would bet all the money in my bank account that Kyle Rittenhouse is still going to do what Kyle Rittenhouse originally said he was going to do. He's going to write in Ron Paul, and no one will ever know. No one will ever know if he does it or not. He's going to lie publicly to appease the fucking woke cancel mob that's been coming at him, and then he's going to go and does what he wants in private, because ain't no one gonna do anything about it anyway. It's just absolutely disgusting behavior. And I got to tell you, like, it's like times like this, it kind of makes interesting alliances, because Bryson Gray and I are now completely on the same page. Bryson Gray and I, for years, did not like each other. And Bryson and I have very different worldviews. Bryson is a very, 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 very conservative Christian. He believes things that I don't think are correct. But I will say this. I hung out with Bryson and his lovely wife, and she is a very lovely woman, in Detroit when I was there for AFPAC. And it was kind of like, it was just nice. It was just nice. And it was like, I gotta get, like, Bryson is actually, like, he's a good soul. I might not agree with him on everything, but I really do feel like he's a good soul. He has a good heart. His wife has a very good heart. And listen, man, if you can marry a good woman like that, it kind of says a lot about you, I think, in some respects. So Bryson Gray and I were, like, both railing on the conservative right today. And it was funny because we were doing it from completely different angles. But both Bryson Gray and I, and ultimately Bryson's wife actually chimed in on this as well, ultimately agreed that Trump needs to lose. I really firmly believe this. Trump needs to lose. Because if Trump wins, with the conservative right and the influencers behaving like this, it's just going to get worse. They're going to feel validated. They're going to feel vindicated. They're going to have no reason to change their behavior. They're going to double down, because you have to treat conservatives like retarded kindergartners, okay? Not just normal kindergartners who are stupid anyway. You have to treat conservatives as though they are retarded kindergartners that are just running around and throwing shit and crying every time they don't get something they want. And you have to understand that the minute that you give retarded kindergartners, and no offense to retards out there, I suppose, but, like, the minute that you give retarded kindergartners, like, positive reinforcement, or you give them what they want, you give them the toy that they're crying that they can't have, they're just going to keep crying. You have to treat conservatives at, like, the most basic level, because most of them, and listen, I'm not, if you're feeling personally offended right now and you're in my chat and you're like, I'm a conservative, Colin, are you telling me I'm a retarded kindergartner? Well, listen, man, if you're following my content, you're probably smarter than the average bear, which means you're probably smart enough to know that I'm making a broad generalization right now, because I can't enumerate every single individual conservative on a YouTube video. That's not a reasonable expectation. And if you're smart enough to understand my content, you're smart enough to know that, right? So you have to treat them at the most basic level. And if you give them positive reinforcement, then they're just going to keep doing what they're doing. If you give them the toy, if they start crying and they want that toy and you don't want to give them that toy, but they start crying and they start banging their fists on the floor and they start throwing shit at the walls and they start name calling and they threaten you, and you give them the toy they want, they're going to go, aha, that worked. I'm going to do that again next time. And so it is now absolutely imperative that Trump lose. And I was like, you know what? Like, everyone was saying today, like, Kyle Rittenhouse didn't even say that he was going to vote for Kamala Harris. Kyle Rittenhouse said, I'm going to write in Ron Paul because I'm going to vote for someone that I believe in. And then conservatives responded by saying, you're voting for Kamala Harris then. Like, here's the point that I'm at. I was either not going to vote at all. Like, Trump, there was still a minute little chance that Trump could have won my vote back. There really was. If Trump had denounced war with Iran, he could have potentially won my vote back. If Trump had fired his campaign advisors, Chris Lasavitas and Susie Willis, and actually started actually started running a legitimate presidential campaign that was about pandering to the right, not pandering to the moderates or the liberals, then Trump could have won my vote back. I am now fully committed that Trump needs to lose. I will not vote for Trump. I don't care what the fuck he says. I don't care what the fuck he does. Trump needs to lose, because if the conservative right wins, they will just keep doubling down on this and things will just get worse. And sometimes you need to take a short-term loss in order to have a long-term game. I'm going full on accelerationist on this situation, which is kind of what I started doing when I said I was embracing fascism in the first place. Like, I really believe that a dictator is the only thing that could actually solve this problem. We can bicker about, well, that's the proper definition of fascism. It actually doesn't fucking matter. It doesn't fucking matter, okay? I'm going full on accelerationist. Trump needs to lose, because the only way that the right is ever going to become effective is if they lose badly, they get all their fucking toys taken away, all the people that caused this situation are exiled, and Nick Fuentes and the Groypers take over. That's really what I want. I want Nick Fuentes and the Groypers to take over. That's what I want. And again, I don't agree with Nick Fuentes and the Groypers on everything, but you know what? I would even take a Christian monarchy at this point over whatever bullshit is going on the right. I don't want any part of it. Don't want any part of it at all. And they see nothing wrong with what they're doing. They have no self-awareness. They don't take a moment to reflect and be like, are we really acting like the good guys here? When we're wishing that Kyle Rittenhouse literally gets thrown in prison because he said he doesn't want to vote for Trump because of Trump's gun policies, and then we struggle session him and cancel him publicly, are we really being the good guys here? Is this really how we want the country to be run? Not a moment of self-reflection, not a moment of self-awareness, and this is not a group of people that is serious. This is not a group of people that is going to be the adult in the room. This is not a group of people that is going to provide any meaningful change. And so, and I'm so committed to Trump losing at this point that I might actually vote for Kamala Harris. And those are words I never thought I would say, but I'm actually serious about this. Like, if conservatives want to yell at me for the next, 95 days or something and say, you're not voting for Trump means that you're voting for Kamala Harris, fine. Fucking fine. Fine. Not only will I not vote for Trump, if you want to be in my fucking face and whining and complaining at me saying, you're voting for Kamala Harris, you're voting for Kamala Harris, you're voting for Kamala Harris, then fucking fine. Not only will I not vote for Trump, I will proactively vote for Trump's main opponent. If that's the way you want to play it, I'll play that game. I don't give a fuck. And in New Hampshire, Kamala Harris is probably going to win. It's going to be close in New Hampshire between Trump and Kamala Harris is currently beating Trump in the polls in New Hampshire. So one more vote for Kamala Harris if conservatives keep this bullshit up. Maybe if conservatives actually start to learn their lesson, be like, you know what? Maybe struggle sessioning people is not the best way to get votes. Maybe we should rethink this. They start changing their behavior, then maybe I'll just go back to voting for Chase Oliver or not voting for Trump at all. But like, I'm not voting for Trump at this point. I'm gonna be like clear, like fucking final answer. I'm done. I don't want to see anything else. You're struggle sessioning a fucking kid because he didn't give you what you wanted, and you feel like he has some obligation to you for the rest of his life. It's gross and it's disgusting, and I will not vote to support that. The conservative right needs to figuratively die in a fire. I don't mean anyone actually physically dying. I'm not being literal, YouTube. I don't wish violence or death on anyone, but the conservative movement, the MAGA cult, and it is a cult, everyone, but like everyone knows that, right? Like socialists are a cult, the left is a cult, fine. MAGA is also a cult. And we've seen this over and over and over and over and over again. Anytime that anyone steps out of bounds with what conservatives want you to say, you are canceled, you are smeared, you are defamed, you are harassed, you are struggle sessioned. They are worse than the fucking left. And they need to be taught a lesson. And the only way that you teach retarded kindergarteners a lesson is to take away all their fucking toys and send them to their rooms and lock the fucking door and leave them in there to cry their tears until they run out of them and they run out of steam, and then they can continue to stay in there for a little while longer just to teach them the fucking lesson. And then maybe if they start to grow the fuck up and take this a little bit more seriously, then maybe you open the door. And maybe you let them pop their head out, and maybe you put them under some supervised thing where now they're sitting in the living room, and maybe you give them one toy to play with and you see how they play with that toy. And then the minute they go back to their old habits, you send them right back to the fucking room. Nope, we're not doing this. And you keep fucking doing that until they learn. The only way that conservatives are going to learn to stop acting like unhinged fucking retards is if Trump loses. That's it. Sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. And we may as well just embrace accelerationism, because when we start accelerating the demise of the conservative right, when we start accelerating the demise of the MAGA cult, that means there's going to be a void created. And that void can be filled by Nick Fuentes and the Groypers. And then maybe they can get in there a little bit sooner and start cleaning up the mess sooner. And I know Nick is still young. He can't run for president yet. But maybe if they sneak in there because the whole fucking thing is burnt to the ground, maybe we can actually start to, I don't know, put together something that's going to make some progress. Probably not. We're probably all fucked. We're probably all fucked anyway. And that's kind of my ramble for the beginning as we're letting people come in. Benjamin Elliott, thanks for being a member of the channel. Happy Friday. My high school orchestra teacher had this brilliant poster of the individual going his own way while the rest were hive mind. I think of that today. Isn't that funny? Is we used to kind of glorify this idea of like standing up to the mob or being rebellious or not engaging in groupthink and, doing your own thing no matter what other people think of you. That used to be, I'm old enough to remember the 90s. I know I'm, of course, 29 years old, and I will always be 29 years old, and I will never get one day older than 29. But I do actually remember the 90s. The 90s were a time of rebellion, of encouraging individuality, of not giving a shit what the establishment and the machine thought of you, of purposefully pushing back on stereotypes and all these ideas. And it was great. And that was what the music was about. That was what the culture was about. That's what I grew up in. But no, not anymore. Not anymore. But it's nice to reminisce sometimes. Thank you, Benjamin. Nick Incognito was for Trump until they struggle session Kyle. Fuck them. Yeah, and I asked conservatives on Twitter, I was like, how many votes do you think you guys lost today? And they were like, we didn't lose any. I was like, I don't think that's right. Conservatives actually convinced themselves that they could publicly struggle session Kyle Rittenhouse in front of tens of millions of people, and they wouldn't lose a single vote out of it because, no one, it's almost like no one ever left the left because they were sick of leftist struggle sessioning bullshit. Oh, wait, that's exactly why I left the left. That's exactly why many people I know left the left, is they didn't want to be struggle sessioned by their fucking friends. And then conservatives think we can struggle session people and they won't leave us because we're not the left. Well, no. No. You don't get special privileges because you're not the left, conservatives. You don't. And you did lose votes today. Trump lost votes today because of your bullshit. And probably ain't going to win them back. Because, and I had someone on my Twitter say, well, Carlin, you shouldn't be judging Trump by his supporters. Yes, I fucking should. I absolutely should be judging Trump by his supporters. You want to know why? Because your supporters reflect the person you are. Your supporters reflect the campaign that you've run. Your supporters reflect the values that you have. If I can't judge Trump on the basis of his supporters being assholes who are struggle sessioning a kid, then what the fuck can I judge them on? Donnie the Misfit in the house. Today it was proven on X that the right doesn't care about the Second Amendment more than Donald Trump. Regardless of if Kyle Rittenhouse flip-flops on his principles, the message was made loud and clear. And yeah, that's the other thing. Conservatives have no principles at all. None. Kyle Rittenhouse was actually taking a principled position. Kyle Rittenhouse was saying, 2A is my number one issue. 2A is my only issue. Trump isn't good on 2A, so I'm not voting for Trump. It's really that simple. Really that simple. And instead, and these losers on Twitter who the entire time that I've been involved in this space have been like, shall not be infringed over every fucking thing. Shall not be infringed. The minute that Kyle Rittenhouse is like, Trump kind of actually sucks on 2A and he really shouldn't suck so much and I'm not going to vote for him because he sucks, they're all of a sudden like, oh, it's okay to infringe because you got to vote for Trump. You don't have any choice. I even saw a friend of mine, Eric Matheny, and I love Eric Matheny and I adore Eric Matheny, and I am quite frankly shocked that this is the line that Eric took. And I don't want to shit talk the guy at all because he's been very good to me and I do genuinely love him as a friend. He put out this video saying, what Kyle doesn't understand is that this is a binary choice and that you have to choose between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And I was like, no, Eric, I don't. No, I don't. I absolutely do not. I 100% do not need to choose between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Like, just like in reality. And no matter how many times you say, if you're not voting for Trump, you're voting for Kamala Harris, that actually makes me more inclined not to vote for Trump. Yep, Eric. Now, Eric was nicer. Eric didn't cancel Kyle. Eric was more trying to be like the good big brother to Kyle. He's being like, bro, like, what are you doing? Like, he was doing like that. So I respected it a little bit more. I'm not putting Eric in the same category as the people who were wishing Kyle Rittenhouse go to prison, essentially. But I was just really bummed, man. I was like, no, I really don't need to vote for Trump. No, I don't. Too many mistakes have been made. Too many and in a matter of weeks too. Too many unforced errors. I'm not down for that, man. But appreciate you being here, Donnie. Anthony, thank you for the super chat. Unrelated, but I remember you being physically attacked while covering a riot. I'm an EMT and was wondering if I could join a journalistic team for such scenarios and how I go about it. Any ideas? I mean, I was chased by a mob, but like, I don't know, man. I would just say get out there and do it. Like, I mean, that's kind of like the only advice I have is like there are a lot of like, you know, I would connect, like, I'm not really doing boots on the ground stuff. I'll do undercover stuff every once in a while, but I'm not I'm not one of those people that I'm not going to go out and cover riots and protests because I'll get beat up and I don't want to. But there are people that do that stuff. And so what I would do is probably connect with the people that are doing like the actual boots on the ground protest coverage, the riot coverage and stuff like that. And I would talk to them about that because they're going to have much better thoughts than I would about it. Because like what I do when I cover things like undercover is I wear a disguise. Like, people don't know it's me. I sign up under a fake name. I kind of like, I just keep a low profile. I'm not going to do anything in where I need an EMT or anything, hopefully, unless I'm discovered and then I may get the shit kicked out of me. But like typically I'm not going to need that stuff because I'm not covering protests or anything like that. But there are people who might need that. And so I would definitely reach out to them. But I appreciate the super chat, bro. Thanks so much for that. Anyway, let's get into business, shall we? Now, I do have some bad news. There will not be a beer vote today. Now, normally on happy hour, I go to the store and I get 4 craft beers. And then I bring the craft beers back and you guys vote on which ones I drink. But today we're not going to do that. And there's a very special reason why. Hang on. Well, there's actually 2 special reasons why. There's 2 special reasons. The first special reason is that it's August 1st. Now, August 1st for normal people still is technically summer, right? It's like 8,000 degrees outside. It's so fucking hot. And so we might be fooled into thinking that it's still summer, except that when I went to the beer store today, we got the first delivery of Pumpkin of the season. Pumpkin beer is back, and Southern Tier Pumpkin is the king of all pumpkin beers. It is an 8.6% alcohol content beer that tastes just like a pumpkin pie. If you have never had pumpkin, you might not be able to find it just yet in your location because it's still very, very early. I think this literally just got delivered to the store like today. But if you have a chance to try pumpkin, especially if you have a chance to try it on tap, you order that pumpkin, man. If you've never had it, it is one of the best beers that you're ever going to have. It is so effing good. And even if you don't like pumpkin beer, still try it because it's really effing good. Now, pumpkin beer for me is either really hit or really miss. Like some pumpkin beers I really love, some pumpkin beers I think are gross. This tastes like pumpkin pie. It's so good and it'll get you drunk. And I saw it. I was like, I have to have it. And so we got the first pumpkin of the season. Look, I've even got my pumpkin snifter, my Southern Tier pumpkin snifter glass that I'm going to be drinking out of today. So that's number one reason is I basically bought a 4-pack of these and I'm going to be partaking. But I also want to show you guys this. This is a very, this is a special treat. I don't know if we're going to get to this one today or if we're going to do it tomorrow for Socialism Saturday. It might be a bit much to do it today. But when I was streaming earlier this week, when I was streaming that White Dudes for Kamala call, I basically at the end, I said something like, I was trying to get a $20 super chat to meet a goal. And I said, if you donate a $20 super chat, I'll donate an additional $20 and I will use that $20 to go buy an extra alcohol content beer and drink this week. And so I did, because someone did send me the $20 super chat. And I've actually had this one on my list for a while. This is like a 13% beer. This is from Equilibrium Brewing Company, and it's called Honey Hazelnut Crisp, and it's going to be real thick. It's going to be real thick like oil. And this is an imperial stout with hazelnut, honey, and Madagascar vanilla, and this will get you fucked up. This is an expensive. This was like $25 for this bottle. This is like imperial bourbon barrel aged, like really thick, really amazing, like dessert. This is a sipping beer. This is a beer that we sip with our pinky out as though we are highfalutin. That's what this is. So I've got this too, but I really want to start with the pumpkin because I love this beer so much and I'm so happy it's back. And that's what we're going to do. But fundamentally, doesn't Trump align more with your values? No. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. Trump wants to go to war with Iran. I am anti-war. Trump wants to send all our money to Israel. I don't want to send my money to Israel. Trump wants to what else am I mad about? Trump repeatedly denounced Project 2025, which is one of the stupidest things Trump has ever done in his life. Denouncing Project 2025 to the point where Project 2025 completely fell apart. That's one of the stupidest things Trump has ever done in his life. Trump is deliberately pandering to moderates and centrists and liberals. I don't want Trump pandering to moderates and centrists and liberals. So no, Trump does not align more with my values than Kamala. I don't think Trump is going to do shit on issues that I care about. I want Trump to crush the fucking left. I want Trump to be the dictator that the left says he is. He's not going to do any of that shit. So no, Trump does not align with my values more than Kamala does. Absolutely not. Anyway, let me put this in the fridge. Hang on. All right, so that's in the fridge. Let me pour this beer. Hang on. You guys can see how beautiful the pumpkin is. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. If you guys are drinking something fun, let me know in the chat what you are drinking today. Happy Friday. Oh, yeah, choosing J.D. Vance. That's another mistake that Trump made. The first pumpkin of the season. Cheers, everyone. May the weather get cooler soon. May summer go away. May the heat wave go away. May we welcome fall in with the beautiful crisp air and the colored leaves. Cheers to all of you. Happy Friday. It's so good. It's so good. It's pumpkiny. It's cinnamony. It's alcoholic. It's very alcoholic. And we're going to need some alcohol today because we are going to be watching a college class. We are going to be watching a college class from 10 years ago. Michel Foucault is known as the godfather of queer theory. Judith Butler is the godmother of queer theory. Michel Foucault is the father of queer theory. And so I, for a while, wanted to do a more of a class on Michel Foucault. And luckily, this class showed up in my recommendations, and it is from 10 years ago. This was published to YouTube on February 13th, 2014, back when I was still working in higher education. It is from the University of British Columbia, and it is called Michel Foucault, The History of Sexuality, An Introduction. And it is about an hour and a half long, right? Yep, an hour and 40 minutes long. So it's a long ass class. But the comments on the video seem to be like, this was a really great class. It was like having a conversation. This was really easy to listen to. So I thought that we would take some time on a Friday with beer to watch this class on Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is a man. It's French. So that's why gay man. And we're going to learn what he had to say. And I think that it'll be an interesting thing for us to kind of try to see how this fits into queer Marxism and how this fits into queer activism today. Because we've covered Judith Butler quite a bit. Judith Butler, of course, is the they, them. Actually, I can't even say Judith Butler is a woman anymore because Judith Butler is a they, them. And Judith Butler is basically her big thing is gender performativity, which basically means that we perform our gender, and we can change our gender as easily as just changing the performance. We can change our gender as easily as we change our clothes. This is why Drag Queen Story Hour got introduced as a thing to target kids. It's not about sexualizing kids. It's not about grooming kids. It is about teaching kids that changing your gender is as easy as changing your clothes. And you can put on a new costume, and that makes you a new gender. And what the real goal is to abolish the gender binary, which is an attack on capitalism, because they believe capitalism created the gender binary, which created the nuclear family. The nuclear family upholds capitalism. And so that is why they want to teach kids that gender is just a performance. Because if you teach kids that gender is just a performance, they're more likely to identify as genderqueer, gender non-binary, and that directly attacks the gender binary, which is really what the goal of the entire thing is. Again, it's not about sexualizing children. It never was. Anyone who tells you it's about sexualizing children is lying to you and just trying to get those grifting conservative bucks, so don't listen to any of them. But that's Judith Butler. Now we're going to be diving into the world of Michel Foucault. And we're going to be learning how Michel Foucault contributed to this crazy, crazy world. That is what we're going to be watching today, guys. Please do make sure to mount the like button for me. And as a reminder, please make sure you are subscribed to the Substack, which is Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com. And this is where you can find my breakdowns of the left of the, you can find video clips. You can find the Woke 101 series in which I explain very simple concepts about the left and break them down into easy to explain terms. So you can explain it to your friends, your family, you can share the content, all that good stuff. If you want to support the work I'm doing, the very best way to do it is by heading over to the Substack and signing up for a membership of $8 a month, $80 a year. We're going to be doing a membership drive in August. I know August has already started, but it's going to be really and earnestly starting next week because it's Friday. I'm not launching a membership drive on a Friday when I have beer. So we're going to be starting that next week, but we can get a kickstart on it now. If you want us to head over and join, you get a variety of perks to include joining my supporter Discord, coming and watching movie night with us. We'll be doing, in dedication to Murphy's Pool on Sunday at 8 p.m., we will be watching the classic Ryan Reynolds comedy, Waiting. If you've never seen Waiting, it's fucking hilarious. And I'm not usually a fan of that type of movie. I don't usually like comedies because I think a lot of comedies are stupid. But Waiting is hilarious. And we are going to be watching that at 8 p.m. on Sunday in the supporter Discord in honor of our great dear friend Murphy's Pool and his birthday, which was actually last month, but we were doing Patriotic Movie Month. And so Jen and I wanted to do it in August. So that's the way it worked out. Anyway, sign up as a supporter on the Substack. You can come and join us in the supporter Discord. You can join us for a movie night. Got lots of other cool stuff going on in the Substack as well. And of course, my work is completely funded by you guys, so I can't do it without you. Also, make sure that if you're on Telegram, make sure you follow the Telegram channel if you want announcements when I'm going live, when I publish new content, stuff like that. People ask for some way to get alerts on their phone when I go live because YouTube doesn't do its one and only job and notify people. And so I did make a Telegram channel. Finally, I probably should have done it a long ass time ago, that you guys can sign up for to get alerts when I go live on the internet. And I appreciate that. And of course, all super chats do go to support the work I'm doing. We have a $100 goal per stream of super chats, just a pretty modest goal, just to make sure that, I can afford to spend time doing all this stuff with you guys, because that really does help out. And so if you want to send in super chats, help me hit that $100 goal. If 20 of you send in $5 in the course of the stream because you appreciate that I'm watching this content with you, breaking it down, showing you content that no one else on the internet is showing you, then that will help contribute to that goal. And I do really appreciate it. Oh, one more thing. Bot. Another surprise for the stream today, bot. Check this out. Look what I just got. I just got a new shipment of slime. So I may not have beers to show off today, but I do have a new box of slime. Don't tell my husband. My husband is out downstairs sleeping on the couch, and he missed it when I snuck the slime box upstairs because I already have a lot of slime. But the thing is, slime wears out and you have to replenish your slime. And so I have a new shipment of slime and I'm going to be exploring on the stream today. So I'm excited about that. Anyway, yeah, we're basically doing a queer theory training combined with a slime unwrapping video combined with drinking on the internet. Nothing can go wrong with this plan. It's going to be perfect. All right, everyone, please make sure you mount the like button for me. Please make sure you are subscribed to the channel if you are not already. Please make sure you have a drink in hand. You're going to need it. We are watching Michel Foucault, The History of Sexuality, an introduction to learn all about the godfather of queer theory.
Outline of the way I'm approaching Foucault's text. So one of the things that I'm trying to do for you today is to give you what I think his overall argument is. And that's because this is a really complicated text.
Oh, shit. No! Don't start over! Hang on, I accidentally hit the wrong button because I was trying to pause it for Gloria. Carlin, I have someone who wants to show where all the crazy gender pronouns is coming for. Which of your Substack should I direct her to first? I have an article in the Woke 101 series. Hang on. I'm going to give you something for right now. I have an article in the Woke 101 series about non-binary. Hang on. Here's an article about the non-binary stuff. I just put the link in the chat on YouTube. But Gloria, I'm actually working on an article where I'm basically going to be going into like all sorts of crazy effing pronouns and like crazy gender identities and stuff like that. So I've kind of had that like on the back burner for a minute, but I'm hoping to publish it like within the next week or so because there's just a lot of crazy shit. So there will be something coming that I think is going to be better, but a good place to start is that non-binary one. Oh, come on. Don't do this to me, YouTube. Don't do this to me. Come on. Oh, I fucking hate YouTube. It's so glitchy lately. I may need to update my Chrome. That might actually be the problem. No!
As well as
there we go. We're back.
A kind of outline of the way I'm approaching Foucault's text. So one of the things that I'm trying to do for you today is to give you what I think his overall argument is. And that's because this is a really complicated text. And if you don't get what Foucault's saying in terms of his argument, then it's really hard to really discuss it well. And it's not the easiest text to get his argument out of, let's just say. And it's a bit of a convoluted argument too. So I want to make sure we avoid some of the common mistakes that people tend to have. and look at what he does seem to be really saying. And then hopefully that'll set you up for some good discussions and seminars this week. So that's the plan. And that's why I have a handout, because the outline of his argument that's on the top, those boxes, that's basically the second half of my lecture, but I'm going to try to explain it in more detail. But that way you have it all in one place. Here's part of what he's responding to. Here's his response. Here's another part of what he's responding to. Here's his response, etc. And when all this stuff goes online, I'll also ask John to post a copy of this handout as well, so it's available for anyone there. Okay, so to begin, I want to look on the handout at a couple of quotes from Foucault and Freud.
Freud!
Now, you'll notice that's not an actual photograph of Foucault. There's a reason for that. Since these lectures are being video recorded and posted on YouTube, I have to be very careful about not using copyrighted images.
Oh, for
well, this
fuck's
is a
sake.
copyrighted image, but it's under a license that allows me to reuse it. I could find no photographs of Foucault that were allowed to be used in this sort of public forum posted onto the web. This is a painting that someone did from a photograph of Foucault, who kindly allowed it to be used in situations such as this. But later, I took some pictures of my own books of Foucault that have pictures of him, and hopefully that's allowed because it's my own picture. We'll see. Someone might think that's not okay.
That's not how that works.
But we've got Foucault and Freud, and on the handout, I want you to skip the first quote underneath the boxes and go down to the second. Freud and Foucault on secrets. And this quote from Freud is one that I talked about 2 weeks ago. Freud says, if it is true that the causes of hysterical disorders are to be found in the intimacies of the patient's psychosexual life, so hysteria is caused by some sort of intimacy, some sort of hidden thing in their psychological and sexual life, and that hysterical symptoms are the expression of their most secret and repressed wishes, then the complete exposition of a case of hysteria is bound to involve the revelation of those intimacies and the betrayal of those secrets. So that's, in a nutshell, Freud's response, or Freud's idea about the secrets
Hey, Bobby,
within our
I
psyches,
appreciate it. Thank
and
you.
why sometimes we may have to expose those because they could be causing symptoms like hysterical symptoms. And once we bring those ideas to consciousness, they can be expressed in other ways and the symptom will go away. Well, I noticed again on this reading of Foucault, as I've read it many, many times before.
My slime exploded. The slime exploded. It's all over the place. What the fuck? It literally exploded. What the fuck? I've never had this happen before in my history of purchasing slime. It exploded all over the place. Boo! Slime Obsidian, you failed me! Oh no! Oh no! It exploded everywhere. It's all over everything. Bullshit! Whatever. Dude better send me some new slime. I've been a good customer to him. It's not cool. Now I got slime all over everything. Can't even get my video to start again.
But especially in connection to what we just read with Freud, I noticed that the word secrets appears over and over in this text by Foucault. And maybe that's because I made it the theme of my Freud lecture, and so it just stood out to me. But here's one place where Foucault talks about secrets. The next quote under Freud and Foucault on secrets. This oft-stated theme that sex is outside of discourse, and that only the removing of an obstacle, the breaking of a secret, can clear the way leading to it, is precisely what needs to be examined. So Freud's very idea that sex is something hidden and secretive within us that needs to be divulged, that's precisely what needs to be examined. So he's questioning that idea of sex. Does it not partake of the injunction by which discourse is provoked? Is it not with the aim of inciting people to speak of sex that it is made to mirror, at the outer limit of every actual discourse, something akin to a secret whose discovery is imperative, a thing abusively reduced to silence and at the same time difficult and necessary, dangerous and precious to divulge? There, among other things, he's talking specifically, I think, about Freudian psychoanalysis, that the idea that within us there is some kind of hidden secret about our sexuality that we are trying to repress, that is being kept down by our conscious or unconscious, probably, psyches, so that we can't talk about it and think about it consciously. So therefore it's a secret. That whole idea is something that he's going to question. And in this quote, Foucault says, thinking about sexuality as a secret in that way encourages us to talk about it. Thinking about it as something that's dangerous to keep hidden inside encourages us to talk about it. And as we'll see, part of his main argument in this book is about how we have not been repressing sexuality. We have not been keeping it under wraps. We have been talking about it more and more and more, and studying it more and more and more. And one of the ways we encourage people to keep talking about it is to say, you've got a hidden secret inside you that needs to come out because it's dangerous if you keep it repressed. That's what is encapsulated in this quote. And then the second quote set of quotes I want you to look at is on the back, Freud and Foucault on the spontaneous upward movement of what is repressed. This is not from Dora. This is two quotes from other texts by Freud. We may suppose that the repressed exercises a continuous pressure in the direction of the conscious, so that this pressure must be balanced by an unceasing counter pressure. That's from a text called Repression by Freud. The idea here being that once things that you don't want to think about, often sexual things, once those are repressed into the unconscious.
Okay, I'm getting the slime problem taken care of, guys. Thank you for bearing with me.
To move upward.
They sort of
watching want
diligently
on their own to come out. This is the way that Freud talks about the return of the repressed. The repressed often wants to return. It's hard to keep down. And a similar quote from a different text called
Hey, bro.
An Outline of Psychoanalysis. The unconscious.
Bro, you want to know why you guys don't know anything, and you want to know why you guys don't understand the left at all, and you want to know why you will inevitably lose to the left, and they will queer all your kids, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Do you want to know why? It's because, big man, you can't open your ears and listen to someone that you don't want to listen to. It's because you are so kind of just like, I mean, let me just say, like, you're a massive pussy. Like men like this, they like to say that men should be in charge and women shouldn't do anything because men should be in charge of everything and women should just shut the fuck up because men should be in charge. But they are so manly and so masculine and so powerful that they just can't even sit and listen to a woman talk about what they believe. And because, you know, they're a big man and they're going to control the world and they're going to rule the world and they're going to fix all the things, but they don't have the patience to sit for more than 5 minutes and listen to someone they disagree with. Do you really think that you're ever going to change anything, that you're ever going to solve any problems if you literally can't listen to someone that you disagree with? It means you don't even understand what the problems are. Ain't never going to do anything. Ain't never going to accomplish nothing. Just complain and whine on the internet. That's it.
Just has a natural upward drive and desires nothing better than to press forward across its settled frontiers into the ego and so to consciousness. So similar idea. And Foucault also questions this idea from Freud on page 60 in a slightly different context. That is when he's talking about confession, which we will look into in a bit more detail later. But Foucault says the obligation to confess is now relayed through so many different points, is so deeply ingrained in us that we no longer perceive it as the effect of a power that constrains us. On the contrary, it seems to us that truth, lodged in our most secret nature, demands only to surface. that if it fails to do so, this is because a constraint holds it in place. This sounds exactly to me like what Freud is saying. The violence of a power weighs it down, and it can finally be articulated only at the price of a kind of liberation.
Liberation!
So here he's saying, yeah, it looks like
liberation
the truth
from
about our
normativity.
unconscious, about ourselves, about our sexuality that has been repressed, just wants to come out, just has this voluntary movement. Well, it's not voluntary because it's unconscious and it's not an agent, but just has a natural movement to come to consciousness. Foucault diagnoses that and says, actually, we no longer perceive that as the effect of a power that constrains us. What he means is, rather than those things just sort of wanting of themselves to come out, we've been subject to power relations that pull those things out of us, that require that we speak about those things. And it's become so common that we no longer see that power anymore. We just think, oh, our unconscious desires need to come out. They just want to. And what Foucault's going to say is, we've been subject to what he calls biopower, which is a very large category of different kinds of relationships between people, states, schools, employers, in which we are continually incited, asked, encouraged to talk more and more about sexuality. And in so doing, we are releasing that which seems unconscious and seems a hidden desire, but in a way is actually being pulled out of us by these power relationships. So those two quotes kind of encapsulate some of how Foucault questions what Freud is saying and kind of encapsulate important parts of his argument that we will get to in a more detailed fashion soon. Okay. These really have nothing to do with the book. That's why there's a question mark there. When I first saw, if I can remember back, back in undergraduate or grad school or whenever I first read this text, I have this vague memory of looking at the title and going, History of Sexuality. Wonder what that's going to be. What did you think it might be? History of Sexuality. What could that be? You didn't know? Nobody had any thoughts before you opened the book?
I worked out the slime situation.
Sex? In what sense? Well, okay, you don't have to go into any detail. Yeah, the way that different cultures, different time periods treat sex and sexual behaviors, that makes sense to me. Devin. Yeah. In which case, you might expect a bigger book than this, because it's only 150 pages. And are we going to cover all of human history in 150 pages? Well, first of all, let me say that this text is kind of like an outline of what he says he's going to do later. It's a short text because he claims he's going to go into a lot more detail on things like studying the hysterical woman, the child's sexuality, the perversions. So this is kind of an overview. So really, if he were to do deeply the study he was going to do, it should be longer. But it doesn't even do what I thought, which is the same as what you guys were thinking, just the title might mean to me. The title would mean to me, well, let's look at ancient Greece here. Let's look at the man bargaining for sex. What was sexuality like in ancient Greece? What was allowed? What was disallowed? In what sense could men and boys have sexual relations? In what sense was that considered a problem? How was that connected to male and female sexual relations? So we could look at that in Greece. We could look at that in other cultures. And then we could look forward into the medieval times. This is how Raymond and Melusina were betrothed and by the bishop were blessed in their bed on their wedlock from the 15th century, and how religion plays into sexuality. We could look at that. That's not what we've got here, right? We don't have this story of different cultures and different time periods talking about sexuality. We do a little bit, but not that much. More, I think what this book is a history of sexuality as a concept itself. And specifically, sexuality as it is understood in the past couple centuries in the West. Because Foucault never says, I'm going to also look at how sexuality is treated in other parts of the world. There's one part of the text where he claims maybe a different view of sexual pleasure has been followed in Eastern culture. But most of what he's talking about is in Western culture. And there's a reason for that. Foucault wants to talk about the things that now, today, to him and those around him, this is written in 1976, the things that are important to them, what sexuality means to them, and he wants to question, does it have to mean that? How did it come to mean that? Could it mean something different? So he's not trying to do an overarching history of all different cultures and time periods. He's trying to do a history of what sexuality has meant to a particular people at a particular time, and then the history of how that happened. So he's writing in France, 1976. So he's going to be looking at what they thought, and maybe we still think today, sexuality means, and looking at that history. So here's a quote from Foucault. Sexuality must not be thought of as a kind of natural given, something that we are just sort of born with, or something that's just naturally part of a human body, which power tries to hold in check, or as an obscure domain which knowledge tries gradually to uncover. It is the name that can be given to a historical construct. So the deep claim here is that our ideas, or at least theirs in 1976, of sexuality are historically constructed, that they came to be, whatever concept we have of what sexuality is, that came to be at a certain point.
Okay, so I want people to pay attention to this because I knew you were talking about the lecture. That was actually my point. I want people to pay attention to this because what they're going to be talking about. So sexuality is constructed. That's going to be something that we see coming up in queer theory a lot, right? This idea of social construction, what you think your sexuality is constructed. It's like what Judith Butler says when she says gender performativity. Everyone tracking?
And for a certain historical process led to that. And that also means we can think differently. Sexuality, if it is not something absolute, naturally given, we can think differently about it. And a similar quote on page 68.
If sexuality is not naturally given, then we can think differently about it. So if the heterosexual nuclear family isn't naturally given, it's something we socially constructed, then we can think differently about it. Then we can queer the nuclear family. Do you see where they're going with this?
Nearly 150 years have gone into the making of a complex machinery for producing true discourses on sex. It is this deployment that enables something called sexuality. Again, this sexuality in scare quotes, this thing that he says it's something called sexuality, indicates that it's something created. It's something that we have produced and that we could produce differently. It is this deployment that enables something called sexuality to embody the truth of sex and its pleasures. So, what is he doing? Why is he doing a history? I mean, I'm still sort of looking at the title of the book and what it's doing, but why is he doing a history of sexuality? You could just sort of look at, how is it that we think of sexuality today? The history part is important because for Foucault, what history can do is to, as he puts it, make things more fragile. It's a matter of making things more fragile through a historical analysis. And what that means is if you can show that some belief, some value, some concept, some kind of activity or practice has a history, that it was produced at a certain time, it was accepted at a certain time for certain reasons, then you could conceivably say, well, if we're different now, if the historical conditions are different now than they were when that was produced, maybe we can come up with a different practice, a different idea, a different concept, a different value. Right? So it makes things more mobile, and that's what else he says in this quote. And this is an interview from 1983. It's a matter of making things more fragile through this historical analysis to show that what appears obvious to us is not at all so obvious. So the way that sexuality has been considered today, which might just seem obvious, he says, well, we don't necessarily have to think of it that way. It doesn't have to be obvious. I wanted to reintegrate a lot of obvious facts of our practices in the historicity of some of these practices.
The way we think of the nuclear family doesn't have to be obvious. The way we think of the gender binary doesn't have to be obvious. If all these things are just socially constructed, that means we can change the social construct and we can do something differently. It doesn't. It's not obvious that people should just pair up into couples. Maybe we can queer the concept of being in a relationship. We can have more people in the relationship. We can have different compositions in the relationship. It's not obvious that children should belong to their families. Maybe we can, look at different ways to raise children so that it's better for society, because this idea of the nuclear family was just socially constructed to uphold capitalism. Do you guys see where they're going with this? Do you guys see how this happened?
This is a terrible sentence. That's a hard thing to understand. We integrate a lot of obvious facts of our practices into the historicity of some of these practices, and thereby rob them of their evidentiary status, and this is my favorite part, in order to give them back the mobility that they had and that they should always have. By mobility, I think he means changeability, could be different, right? Alterability. So if we look at the history of these practices and see how they came about, we might think, well, we don't need that anymore because that came about for a reason that we no longer need today. Right. Okay, but Foucault has a particular view of his role as an intellectual. So you're going to get in this text a history of how he thinks sexuality has come about in the West. And you're going to get a sense, I think, although it's pretty subtle, of how he thinks there may be problems with that view of sexuality that we have today. But what we don't get is any alternatives. He doesn't suggest, well, yeah, this is the way we've thought about sexuality. Here's maybe why you could think it's problematic. And here's a different way of thinking about it. He doesn't go that last bit. Why? It's because of his ideas of the political role of intellectuals. And that's also on the handout on the back. And I won't read all of this. I'll leave the third one for you to read. But Foucault says in a couple of interviews, here's an observation that people often make of my thought. You do not ever say what the concrete solutions to the problems you pose could be. You do not make proposals. And he says, I absolutely will not play the part of one who prescribes solutions. My role is to address problems effectively, really, and to pose them with the greatest possible rigor, with the maximum complexity and difficulty, so that a solution does not arise all at once because of the thought of some reformer or even in the brain of a political party. The problems that I try to address, these perplexities of crime, madness, and sex, which involve daily life, cannot be easily resolved. It takes years, decades of work carried out at the grassroots level with the people directly involved.
Wait, you don't
and
say.
And the right to speech and political imagination.
You don't say it takes years or decades of work to resolve these issues. You don't say.
Must be returned to them.
Guess what, guys? We're decades out of this.
He claims that his role,
this was 10 years ago,
when he's writing, is just to point out particular problems, to point out thorny issues, to say, for example, here, this is how we've thought of sexuality. This is why we have come to think of it that way. Here's a subtle hint or two as to why you might not think that's a good idea. And then leave you free to decide whether or not to do anything about that yourself. The people who are involved in these particular issues on the ground at the grassroots level are the ones who are supposed to decide what to do. He doesn't want to come in as an intellectual sort of from the top, from the realm of theory and history and say, I, Michel Foucault, know what you ought to do. He wants those who are involved in battles around sexuality to figure out what to do. And then similarly, the next quote, if I don't ever say what must be done, it isn't because I believe there's nothing to be done. On the contrary, I think it is because I think there are 1,000 things to do, to invent, to forge on the part of those who, recognizing the relations of power in which they're implicated, have decided to resist or escape them. There are 1,000 things to do. People who are involved in struggles around sex and sexuality are the ones who need to decide what they should do in their particular circumstances with their particular issues that they're dealing with, and not Foucault. So you might find it a little frustrating by the end of the book when he doesn't say, here's how we have thought about sexuality, here's a great way to do it instead. But that's why he doesn't do it. He leaves it up to us. And if we want to change or not, if we could decide that the way we've been thinking about sexuality is actually just fine. So maybe we just leave it as it is. Last thing about the title. You can get a lot from a title, I suppose. So this one is actually subtitled in French, The Will to Knowledge. And this is a picture of my copy of the book. That's why it's not such a great picture. And this is another big point in his text, that we have a will to knowledge about sexuality that's going to turn into what he calls a scientia sexualis. And he wants to know why we are so concerned about knowledge about sex, about developing a science of sex. And that's such a big theme in his book that in French, it's actually the subtitle. In English, what did the translator do? History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and Introduction. Oh, that's so boring. That doesn't really bring out one of the main questions that Foucault has. We have a will to knowledge. We need to know about sexuality. We think it's something that's so important, we have to develop a science about it. Why? That's one of his big concerns that just gets dropped from the translation that we have. And we'll get into that a little bit later too. All right. What is sexuality? This is a history of sexuality.
What is it? Excellent.
I find
question.
that term very vague. Anybody want to take a stab at it? What would you say sexuality is? Define sexuality. Wow. Maybe you guys find it as hard as I do. Sure, hello.
Everyone has their own version of sexuality. That's what she said.
Mm-hmm.
And how they want to express
So would it include the sorts of people or objects sometimes that would be involved in sexuality, that would be involved in your sexual activities, but also your desires, your activities? So it's going to include that. Anything else? What would sexuality be? Sometimes we talk about it today in terms of sexual orientation, right? That a person's sexuality includes the type of people, the sex of the people that someone is attracted to or that someone has sexual relations with. But I don't want to say that that's all that Foucault is talking about in this book about sexuality. He's not simply talking about homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, though that is part of it. He's also talking in wider terms, as Ola mentioned, about your general sexual desires and pleasures that are even beyond the type of person you would want to do those things with. but could also include the kinds of activities you like to do, whether you want to do those with certain objects or what have you. All of that would be part of sexuality. Now, Foucault gives some examples of what he means by sexuality early on in the book, page 43 and 47. So on 43, here he's talking about the 19th century and the different kinds of sexualities, some of them that were created in the 19th century. So on the bottom of 43, there were craft-ebbing zoophiles and zoerasts. So these are people who get sexual pleasure out of activities with animals. Rolders, onomonosexualists, those who only get sexual pleasure from themselves. And later, mixoscopophiles, that is voyeurism, so people who get sexual pleasure from watching others.
Sexualists.
Gynecomasts, which is actually a description of men who have large breasts. Presbyophiles, which is those who are attracted to old people. Sexoaesthetic inverts, which is now called cross-dressing. And I don't know how to say this, disparunist women who have pain during sex.
How
These are
awful.
just some of the things that were created in the 19th century, some of the categories that were created in the 19th century. But when you look at this is not just like the sex of the person that you're attracted to.
Now, I will say, follow up on the great slime explosion of 2024. This cookies and cream slime is delightful. It comes with like an Oreo cookie charm, which you can kind of see it's kind of covered in the slime now. But this actually kind of feels like what I would imagine the cream part of like the Oreo cookie to feel like. It's just got like a really pleasing texture, and it smells like cookies, and it's really nice. So the great slime explosion may have happened, but the slime still came through.
Includes, those who get sexual pleasure from activities with animals, those who just do it with themselves, those who like to look, those who have large breasts when they're men. That's an interesting thing to put into a sexual category.
I mean, it's
women
something.
who have pain during intercourse.
No, I feel soft
thing to put into a sexual category. So the idea of sexuality in this book, you start to get a sense that it's a pretty wide category. It includes sexual activities, but it also includes discussions about the type of body you might have, physiological expressions of pleasure or pain in that body having to do with sex. There's one other list of, at least that I found recently, one other list of sexualities on page 47, bottom paragraph.
Yeah, for real.
And this again is from the history. This is from the 19th century and early 20th century. The manifold sexualities, those which appear with the different ages, sexualities of the infant or the child.
What?
Those which become fixated on particular tastes.
And that line right there, that is why people think that queer theory is about grooming children and pedophiles, because Foucault was basically a pedophile. Foucault's a pedophile. But that doesn't mean that that's what queer theory is about. And extrapolating that is not accurate. But Foucault was a pedophile. Yeah. I could see how this approach might hook some college-age kids. Some? You think this hooks some college-age kids? You must be new here. This was 10 years ago. This was a long-ass time ago. They've gotten even worse since then. 90% of kids who go to college will be hooked into the activist pipeline. That's not an exaggeration.
Or practices, the sexuality of the invert, which is what is now called homosexual, the gerontophile, which is also love of older people, the fetishist, which is having a sexual obsession about a particular kind of object or part of the body. Those which in a diffuse manner invest relationships, the sexuality of the doctor and patient, teacher and student, psychiatrist and mental patient, and those which haunt spaces, the sexuality of the home, the school, the prison.
Well,
that's a lot of things that have sexuality. That is
okay, so you think it's fair to extrapolate, Space Jack? Please provide me with clips from queer Marxist trainings that back up your point, because otherwise you're literally just making shit up. You're literally making shit up right now. If you think it's fair to extrapolate, then you should be able to go and find any queer Marxist training that's on YouTube, and you should be able to find clips of them talking about kids and, you know, minor attracted people and stuff like that. Do you know how I know you can't do that? Because I have hundreds of hours of queer Marxism trainings on my channel, maybe even thousands of hours at this point. And I've watched a lot of them. Well, I watched everything on my channel. And I know they don't say that. And so if you want to make shit up, that's a strategy. It's a losing strategy. It's a strategy that's going to leave you completely unhinged. But what you can do, Space Jack, is go join the conservative retards on Twitter who have completely misdiagnosed the problem with the left, which means you will never beat the left because you don't understand the left, because you don't listen to the left. All you do is you latch on to one thing that's said in one training, and you make the entire left be about that thing when there is no evidence that the entire left is about that thing just because you heard it one time in one training. So I guess I'm going to wait for you. The very next thing that I want to hear from you is I want to hear the specific name of a specific queer Marxist video that has clips that that allow you to extrapolate one thing said in one training to all queer Marxists. And so we'll wait for that, and I'm sure you'll be able to come through, and we'll see how that goes.
Types of people, what they do to get sexual pleasure, different ages. So infants have asexuality, adolescents have asexuality, women have asexuality, men have a sexuality. These might be different. The sexuality of relationships, doctor and patient might have a sexual component to their relationships. And the sexuality of institutions, schools, prisons, home. That one is interesting. Foucault also does mention, and let me find exactly where that is. Hold on, because it's a little later in my notes. Yeah, around page 27 and 28 in this book. I won't read anything from it. Around page 27 and 28.
Nope. No. This is not what I asked you for. I asked you because we don't deal in philosophy papers here, which you really should know by now. What I asked you for was a practical, on the ground, queer Marxist video. You can find hundreds of queer Marxist videos on YouTube right now. Not that hard. I do it all the time. I've been doing it for years. I want you to find me a activist video, an activist training where they're talking about this, because if your philosophy papers actually have made their way into the real world, then real activists are going to be talking about them in the real world. And if you cannot find evidence of them being talked about in the real world, then all you did was read a fucking paper, and it doesn't mean anything. Do you know how many papers are published in academia every single fucking day? And you find one random fucking paper and you think that means anything? If that paper is not being implemented in the real world, that paper means fucking nothing. So go find me evidence that it's being implemented in the real world. And if you can't do that, then you cannot extrapolate it out. Well, you can, but you'd be an intellectually dishonest asshole. And I know you're not an intellectually dishonest asshole. So I didn't ask you for Halprin's thoughts on the matter. I asked you for a queer Marxist training in the real world. Do you have that, yes or no? We'll wait for your answer. Okay, find the fucking videos then. Find the fucking videos, not videos that you've created. I don't give a flying fuck what you've created. I want a video of real queer Marxists talking about it. If it's really in the real world, like you say it is, then you should be able to go find me a queer Marxist training right now where they are talking about it. If you cannot do that, then shut the fuck up. I've now asked you 3 times for a clip. Do you have it? Yes or no? This is the difference between me and James Lindsay. I don't give a flying fuck what you can find in a philosophy paper. If it hasn't made its way into the real world, then it doesn't fucking matter. The only thing that matters is what is going on in the real world right now. James Lindsay has poisoned people to believe that if they find a paper about something, then that thing is everywhere in the real world, when that is just not how that fucking works. Things get written in academia all the time. Papers get published in academia all the time. It doesn't mean that real world people then take those papers and implement them. If you cannot find me a queer Marxist training where they're talking about these ideas, then it does not exist in the real world, and I don't give a fuck what David Halperin said in a paper one time. So Space Jack, we're waiting again. I've asked you 3 fucking times. Do you have a real world example of a real world training in which they're talking about these ideas? Yes or no? And if you do not, then shut the fuck up. If you do, then what is the name of the fucking video? We'll go watch it right now. We're waiting. This is what happens when you spew bullshit in my chat, guys, just so you know. My video on the queer debate? Wrong. Wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. I was there, bro. I watched that fucking video. I was there. I watched that video. It's not what you're saying it is. So now you're lying. So now we all know that Space Jack is intellectually dishonest and probably a tribalist shill, and that no one should listen to anything Space Jack has to say, because I remember that video, bro. I was fucking there. Wasn't that long ago. And it's not what you're saying it is. Which means you are literally making shit up and no one should listen to you ever again. Thank you for confirming.
As that even the discussion of the architecture of schools can express a concern about sexuality. You can have a layout of the school that makes sure that children
okay, Space Jack, let me be very clear. If you don't stop spewing bullshit in my chat, I'm going to permanently block you. We've now proven that you're making shit up. I don't want to have to keep pausing this video to keep yelling at you. This was not what you're claiming it is. You are literally lying. You're literally making shit up. This is not what I asked for at all. And so now you have 2 options. You can either shut the fuck up and pay attention to the video, or you can provide me with the evidence that I've repeatedly asked you for, because you haven't done it yet. And no amount of whining and no amount of crying and no amount of, but, I swear it was in that video, because I know it wasn't in that video, bro, because I was there when we fucking watched that video. So I know you're lying. I know you're being intellectually dishonest. No amount of whining is going to change that. So now you have 2 choices. Shut the fuck up, or give me a link to a video that is actually what I asked for. And if you can't do that and you keep whining in my chat, then I'm going to permanently ban you, because you've already proven that we shouldn't listen to you. Which would you like? We don't deal in bullshit here. The minute one of you guys tries to get me to deal in bullshit is the minute I'm going to slap that shit right away. You are in my house. I am not in yours. You have not given me the evidence that I asked for. I was very clear in the request. I asked nicely several times. And now here we are. So remember your options. You can either shut the fuck up, or you can provide me with evidence. And if you don't do that and you keep whining in my chat about, but I promise, then I'm just going to permanently ban you so we don't have to listen to it anymore. So it's entirely up to you. You know your options. I've been very clear, and we'll see which one you pick.
Are not able to congregate by themselves in dark places without teachers observing them, so that you couldn't have sexual activities going on there. In another text, not this one, Foucault describes a school in which the
and can I just say this too?
lavatory.
I really do hate that this is the point that I have to get to with people in my chat, because conservative influencers and James Lindsay have lied to so many fucking people, and they've convinced them of things that aren't true. And so this is the point where I have to get to people. I literally have to get in people's face and tell them to shut the fuck up and tell them to stop lying when they genuinely believe that what they're saying is the truth. I'm sure that Space Jack genuinely believes that what they're saying is the truth. The problem is it's not the truth. The problem is the reason Space Jack believes that is that Space Jack has been lied to. And I know that because I've dealt with this for years now, with people coming into my chat saying these crazy fucking things that are unhinged from reality. You cannot get them to shut the fuck up and listen. And I hate that I actually have to be this direct to say, if you don't cut this shit out, I'm permanently banning you so we don't have to deal with it anymore. I fucking hate this. But this is what happens when people start ignoring real world evidence to deal in bullshit that feeds a political narrative. We now know Space Jack has no real world evidence of what they're saying. Most of the people who come in my chat and they make these absurd claims, they have no real world evidence at all. It's always just pinky swear. Trust me, bro. I promise. They're all pedophiles. They're all pedophiles. You know they're all pedophiles, right? You know they're all groomers and pedophiles. And then you ask them, okay, where's the evidence of that? And they can never provide it. If they're all really groomers and pedophiles, the evidence should be pretty easy to provide, but they can't do it. And they can't let it go. They become obsessed with it. And so then I have to yell at them, and then I have to demean them. Yeah, we never did get that answer from Radical Moderate, did we? Radical Moderate's been very quiet lately, hasn't he? We deal in real world evidence on this channel, guys. I think I'm pretty much the only channel on YouTube that's covering leftist content that will only deal in real world evidence. So you'll learn more about what's going on in the real world here than anywhere else. But sadly, we also have to deal with rounds and rounds and rounds of bullshit as we're filtering through all of the nonsense that's been shilled to the conservative right by their do-nothing clout-chasing influencers.
Have doors that only are like from here to here, so that the teachers can make sure to see the heads and the feet of the students so that wrong things are not going on in there. And that the walls on the sides are high enough that the students can't just look over at each other. And Foucault says there's clearly a concern about sexuality going on in the architecture. So even there's a kind of sexuality in the design of buildings, which makes the whole term sexuality start to come apart for me. Like there's so many things that can be included in sexuality in this book. I had to just come up with my own. This is what I think we can say sexuality is in this book. You know, there's probably more to it than this, but this is one way to think about it.
And we have descended into conservative retardia again. They're not all pedophiles. They're just creating an environment for pedophiles. Where's your evidence? Okay, goal becoming. This question is only for goal becoming, so I can prove my point. Goal becoming, I want you to define social reproduction theory for me right now in the chat. The next thing I want to hear from you is the answer to this question, and I want to hear nothing else. What is the definition of social reproduction theory? We are waiting on goal becoming to define social reproduction theory for us. No one else answer. You can't answer. Why is it, do you think? Why is it, do you think, that you can't answer what the definition of social reproduction theory is? Anyone who watches my channel can answer this question. Why is it, do you think, and this is only a question for goal becoming. Why is it that do you think that you cannot answer what social reproduction theory is? It's one of the most relevant things going on in the world today. It's responsible for all the attacks on parental rights. Why do you think you can't answer that question? Why is it, do you think, that you can talk about how this is all about pedophiles when it's not? but you can't answer a basic question about one of the driving things that is responsible for all the attacks on parental rights today. This isn't the answer to the question that I asked. That's not what I asked. Again, I want you to actually answer the question I asked. I need you to listen to the question that I'm actually asking you. The fact is, pedophiles aren't caught in these circles. That's bullshit. Why is it, and the next words out of your mouth better be the answer to the question that I actually asked. Why do you believe that you can't answer what social reproduction theory is? If you answer any other question than that, you're going to get screamed at. So think carefully. Why do you think that you cannot answer what social reproduction theory is? But you can go on and on and on about pedophiles when that's not what these people are doing at all. Nope, that's not the correct answer. We have jobs! We have jobs! We have jobs! We're the only ones with jobs! We are the only people with jobs. Guys, did you know that conservatives are the only people with jobs? And that's why they can't do anything, because they have jobs. They can't be online. They're going to get mad when I yell at them. Oh no! Oh no! A conservative is mad at me? Oh no! The reason that you think this is all about pedophiles and you cannot answer a basic question about what is behind all the attacks on parental rights today is because all of the fucking conservative influencers that you probably listen to are lying to you. That's why. That's why. You absolutely are. If you're talking about pedophiles, you 100% are. You're getting banned in my chat if you keep going. You want to keep fucking whining instead of fucking listening? You can get permanently banned. This is now your option. Shut the fuck up or I'm permanently banning you. You want to keep going? You're the only one chatting in right now. My chat is fucking full of you and your feelings. You don't tell me what to do. You are in my house. I'm not in yours. You are either here to learn or you can get the fuck out and you will not be missed. The reason that you do not know what social reproduction theory is, but you can go on and on and on about pedophiles, is because your influencers are only interested in clout chasing fucking bullshit. And they have lied to you repeatedly, and they have neglected to educate you about what is actually going on. Now, a question for my chat. Everyone that is actually hinged into reality. What is social reproduction theory and how does it relate to parental rights? This is for everyone else other than Gold Becoming, who we know doesn't know anything because they've listened to the wrong people and they've whined and they complained and they've said, pedophiles, 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 pedophiles. What is social reproduction theory and how does it relate to parental rights? Social reproduction theory means that systems will reproduce themselves, that capitalism and the nuclear family will reproduce itself until it is disrupted. Means that the nuclear family is reproduced by capitalism. The attempts to abolish parental rights are an attempt to stop the reproduction of capitalism by getting rid of the nuclear family, which they believe is the literal means of production of capitalism. Social reproduction theory is that social systems will reproduce themselves until they are disrupted. In this case, we are talking specifically about the nuclear biological family, which is the target of what this is. This is not about pedophiles. It's not about grooming kids. It's not about sexualizing kids. This is about disrupting the biological nuclear family. That is what this is about. That is all that this is about. Attacks on the gender binary are an attack on the nuclear family. And they are attacking the nuclear family because they believe that the nuclear family, because of social reproduction theory, reproduces capitalism, which is their ultimate target. That is always the target. It is not about grooming and pedophiles. Anyone who says it's about grooming and pedophiles is listening to horrible people. And sadly, when those people come into my chat, they very rarely shut the fuck up and listen. Social systems reproduce themselves until they are disrupted. Social reproduction theory is that the nuclear family reproduces capitalism. As long as the nuclear family reproduces itself through the gender binary, the system of capitalism will continue. That's what this is about. And quite frankly, if people dislike my tone more than they dislike that the left is trying to abolish the nuclear family because specifically of social reproduction theory, and that's what all the attacks on the gender binary are. If you are more offended by my tone than you are by what is going on in the world, that is a you problem. That is not a me problem. And that just to me tells me that your priorities are all fucked up, or that you're not smart enough to consume my content. And you're just going to be one of those people that's going to be whining about pedophiles, 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 pedophiles all over the fucking internet. And I don't have time for that shit. Thank you.
It seems to refer to some aspects of individuals and relationships, because you can have sexuality between two people. That includes physiological organs and systems, genitals, hormones that are functioning, mental things, desires, feelings, fantasies, pleasures, and then the outward activities and behaviors that one engages in. So it's a sort of a conglomeration of physiological, mental.
No, I'm spiritual. I'm not
actional
religious.
Or behavioral. So when we talk about the sexuality of a person, it's a pretty big unifying thing collecting all of those aspects. Some physiological aspects, some mental aspects, some aspects of their behavior. And maybe there's more to it that Foucault says, but that's what I'm going to use. Now, when he says sexuality is historically constructed, sexuality is not a natural given. One of the things I think he means is that putting all of this stuff together into a category called sexuality, and then labeling people as having this or that kind of sexuality, fetishists, automonosexualists, although I don't think that word is used anymore. Voyeurist, heterosexual, homosexual. That idea of classifying people according to categories by putting all of these disparate parts of the person into one thing we call sexuality, that's what I think he thinks is constructed, is historically constructed. Because we could just look at people as having different feelings, different thoughts, and different activities, but we put some of those together as sexual and others are not. But do we have to? Do we have to think, well, this is part of their sexuality, but this is not? So we have to separate out a whole aspect of a person that is just sexuality. And then do we need to put people into classifications on the basis of that? Sexuality also, Foucault says, and we'll see this in a couple of examples, is considered an important part of one's identity. Once we are classified or classify ourselves as a certain kind of sexual being, as having a certain sexual identity.
You know, I may take Foucault's good example and I might be like, you know, it's not my job to solve any problems. It's just my job to point out that problems exist. And that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my career. I'm just going to be critical of everything and point out all the, in fact, that's kind of like what I do. That's kind of like what I do right now. I'm like, here are all the reasons that conservatives suck and they will never win another election ever. And I don't have any solution to that problem because I have no influence, but I can absolutely point out that conservatives suck and they will never win another election ever for reason X, Y, B, and Z. And then maybe someone else can solve that problem because I ain't going to do it, but someone else can do it. Quite brilliant when you think about it.
Then often this is taken in by people to be an important part of their identity, that I am this kind of person. Now, some of the negative ones, like pedophilia, person is probably not going to take that on as a part of their, important identity. They're probably.
The lecturer on Foucault just said that pedophilia is a bad thing. Which honestly is what I actually do hear from the left. The left is not actually in favor of sexualizing kids. Only the right believes that the left is in favor of sexualizing kids. The left doesn't actually believe that. play.
They're going to want to get rid of that, I think. But something like homosexuality, a person may very well take that on as part of an important part of their identity and say, that is a crucial aspect of who I am, right? So let's just get some examples for today. Because, in 1976, when Foucault was writing, there are sexualities. In 2013 and 2014, what year is it? 2014, there are perhaps even more sexualities. There are different sorts of names and labels and words and identities that may have existed even then. So I looked up a few of these. There's way, way many more sexual identity categories that I'm going to list here. And the icon there is polyamory, which I'll talk about in a minute.
Oh!
These three are the ones you hear most, right? Homosexuality.
That's what the polyamory symbol? Polyamory is how they're queering the nuclear family, guys. Polyamory is the queer solution to the nuclear family. And this was being lectured about back 10 years ago. All right.
Heterosexuality, bisexuality, those are the most common that people talk about or identify as. But there are plenty more. Androphilia and gynophilia, or gynecophilia. Those are similar to heterosexuality, homosexuality, or bisexuality, except that androphilia is a love of or an attraction to males, but it doesn't say whether the person themselves is male or female. Gynecophilia is a love of or attraction to females, but it doesn't refer to whether that person themselves is male or female. So if you notice, heterosexuality and homosexuality refer to both the object of who you're attracted to and the sex you are. And some people are now questioning whether we need to even hold ourselves to a particular sex ourselves. Do I need to say I am just a female? Is it so important to distinguish between male and female? Maybe I don't.
And there it is. There's the attack on the gender binary. Do we even need to call each other men and female? Do I even need to identify as a woman? Maybe I don't need to identify as a woman at all. Maybe that would be too binary in my thinking.
Want to identify myself that way, but I am attracted to males. You could say that. Pansexuality, omnisexuality, that is, I could care less about the sex of my partner. Bisexuality is I like both men and females. Omnisexuality is a little bit different, and then they try to say, I would rather just get rid of the whole idea of sex and gender. Just a person is a person. Polyamory. This doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the sex of the person that you are attracted to. It is more the idea that you don't have to have monogamous relationships, that love is something you can share with many people at the same time equally, as long as everyone is fully consenting and with informed consent. You would never do this if the other person didn't know. That's called adultery, right? If they didn't want you to be with other people and you did it anyway, that's different. This is everyone knows what's going on and everyone is okay with it. That there's no reason to limit your love to just one person. And it can be taken on just as a...
By the way, I want to say, like, it's not as though everyone in a polyamorous relationship is necessarily a socialist or a Marxist or a leftist or anything like that. It's not necessarily that there's anything wrong with this. Again, if you're a consenting adult and you're entering into this consensually and everyone knows what's up, not necessarily anything wrong with this. But what I want people to see is, this is something that leftists are using and have identified as being useful to them in terms of, basically creating a Brave New World type of society where everyone belongs to everyone else. Polyamory might be a great idea for some people. It might be it's probably a horrible idea for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons, but for some people it might work. Nothing inherently wrong with that. My objection comes when something that is otherwise kind of like a non-political thing is hijacked and used in order to destabilize the nuclear family, because they need the nuclear family destabilized if they're going to implement their Marxist utopia. And this is just it's getting people on the road to this Brave New World type of environment where literally it's just about like, sex and, you have a different partner all the time and everyone knows about it and everyone's cool and the state raises the kids and the state owns all the kids and you don't have kids of your own. You just like the kids are bred as like, this is going to be a very real thing. People understand that, right? Brave New World, that whole idea, that's actually going to happen at some point. Probably a long ass time from now. Everyone's going to be doped up on whatever drugs they hand out to make people compliant with this. Brave New World is actually I really do believe that like something similar to Brave New World is going to come about at some point. It might benefit everyone to like reread that book or like go watch one of the movies that was made from it, because not the TV series, not that thing on like Peacock or whatever. Don't watch that. That kind of sucked. But maybe if you wanted to, I guess, but might benefit us to rewatch that
kind of relationship, or even some people take it on as this type of identity.
Maybe I'll do that later.
I am a polyamorous person. That is my sexual identity. And then lastly, just for now, asexuality or non-sexuality. I hear this mostly called asexuality. I think that's a little less of a negative term. Non-sexuality is just an automatic negative.
Well,
but
no, I don't. Hang on.
To people.
No, I've never said by 2030. I said by 2050. I don't think it's going to be 2030 is guys, we are 5.5 years away from 2030. Things change slowly. They don't change that fast. Social change is slow. It's like how you make the Grand Canyon, right? It's like first the Grand Canyon starts with like a little trickle of water, and then it just slowly over the course of millions of years, that little trickle of water becomes the canyon. It's like that. Social change doesn't happen. This whole 2030 thing is not going to happen. It's too fast. Societies don't change that quickly. By 2050, we might be part of the way there. I don't think we'll be the full way there, but we'll be part of the way there.
Who have taken on a sexual identity that says we are simply not interested in sex. We have love relationships. We have very close love relationships. We have affection for other people, but that does not express itself in sexual relations.
They don't want you to notice the change.
And in a way, this can be considered a sexual identity, even though it's a sexual identity that denies the need for sexual activity. So there's many different ways that one could have a sexuality today. And this is just a few, not even a partial list. And then in terms of science, in terms of the way that we have tried to get knowledge of sexuality and study it scientifically today, we certainly see a lot of that happening these days as well as in 1976 and in the 19th century. Some more sexual categories. These are the disorders. This is from the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's used by psychology, the American Psychological Association. And these are just a few of the sexual disorders. You've got exhibitionistic, which is showing, getting pleasure from showing your genitals. Voyeuristic, getting pleasure from, let me get this right. Looking, spying on others in private activities. I'm looking at the DSM-5. Frateristic disorder, touching or rubbing against a non-consenting individual. Sexual masochism disorder, undergoing humiliation, bondage, or suffering. Sexual sadism disorder, inflicting humiliation, bondage, or suffering.
That's considered to be a disorder?
Pedophilic disorder, sexual focus on children.
I inflict pain and suffering on people on the internet all the time. Do I have a sexual disorder from it? Some might say so. In fact, people actually have said so. Whatever, I don't care.
We're in fetishistic disorder, using non-living objects or having a highly specific focus on non-genital body parts. And transvestic disorder, engaging in sexually arousing cross-dressing. Now, these are not necessarily, and this is a new thing with the DSM-5, they want to say that these things are not necessarily always bad, although some of them are. You know, pedophilia, yeah. But
see, pedophilia, bad.
Not always bad. They're trying to say, look, this is only a disorder if you feel personal distress from it, not merely distress resulting from society's disapproval, because that's going to happen even if you feel happy about your identity, but society doesn't. Or you have a sexual desire or behavior that involves another person's psychological distress, pedophilia, injury, or death, or a desire for sexual behaviors involving unwilling persons or persons unable to give legal consent. So all of those things are going to make it a problem and then make it a psychological disorder. Now, why am I bringing up this thing here? This is partly to get us an idea of what sexuality means today, and partly to lead into what Foucault's going to say later about how we have developed over the course of the last 200 years or so a science of sexuality, that rather than not talking about sexuality, we've actually talked about it more and more. We talk about it so much that we've created scientific studies of it. And now we have a bunch of information about sexuality. Now, I don't have the actual DSM-5 book. It's very expensive, I think. I just got bits of it from the internet. But I bet if I read through there, I would get tons of information from all the data that has been collected about sexuality. And that suggests, as Foucault says, we have not repressed sexuality. We have, in fact, opened it up and dug into it and gotten a will to knowledge about creating scientific studies of it. And we still do today. I'll skip that one for the moment. You can look at it later. And then also, when Foucault says sexuality is considered an important part of one's identity.
No, she's not. In fact, she specifically said if it wasn't consensual, then it was not okay. So no, she's not. Listen, can people please stop making assumptions based on conservative bullshit? If it's consensual and it's among adults who have the ability to consent, then it's okay. If it's non-consensual or it's directed at people who don't have the ability to consent, then it's not okay. That is literally what their position is. She's already said it.
Just here's a couple of examples from the Asexuality, Visibility, and Education Network website. An asexual is someone who does not experience sexual attraction. Unlike celibacy, which people choose, asexuality is an intrinsic part of who we are. So just an example of expressing the sense that one's sexuality is important to one's identity. And from the PFLAG Canada website, which is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, sexual orientation and gender identity are important aspects of our overall identity. This kind of thing helps me with two quotes from Foucault that when I've read this in the past, I've been a little confused by it. I think he might mean something like this, but you can decide. On page 69, towards the bottom, he says, "We demand that sex speak the truth, but since it is the secret and is oblivious to its own nature, we reserve for ourselves the function of telling the truth of its truth, revealed and deciphered at last. And we demand that it tell us our truth, or rather the deeply buried truth of that truth about ourselves which we think we possess in our immediate consciousness. We demand that sex tell us our truth, or that deeply buried truth of ourselves that is hidden from us."
Yeah, page 69.
But sometimes when I read this, I think, what does he mean by,
nice.
we demand that sex tell us our truth? I mean, how do I get my truth about myself?
You're all more dirty than
from
I
sex?
am. Jesus
There's a kind of
Christ.
odd thing to say. But if I think about it in terms of my identity, who I am, and that my sexuality, my sexual behaviors, my sexual pleasures, all that goes into who I am. And if I think of that as an important part of myself, then I can get it. And similarly on 78, first full paragraph, "In the space of a few centuries, a certain inclination has led us to direct the question of what we are to sex." Let's direct the question of what we are to sex.
Maybe Foucault was just obsessed with sex. That could very well be.
If we think of ourselves, if we think of our sexuality as an important part of an identity. But you could also think of Freud. And he is talking about Freud in this book quite often, even when he doesn't mention him by name. That for Freud, who we are what's going on in our unconscious, what causes our neuroses, what Dora was dealing with. Most of it had to do with sex. Right? Sex is an explanation for a lot of our behavior for Freud. So there may be some of that going on in Foucault's text as well. Okay, before we do a break, I want to talk just briefly about Foucault himself. And this is where, I've got pictures in my books of him. So I'm not putting these books up because the books themselves are things I think you should read. I just picked some books that have pictures of Foucault on the front. So these are his images of him with his head shaved, which I think he did pretty early on in his life. There are a few pictures available on the web where he has hair, but most of the pictures you'll see of Foucault are bald. And I think the one on the far right is a little bit younger than the other ones, but the one in the middle is a pretty famous picture too. It's just kind of funny the way he's like looking at this. And the one on the left is that most happy picture I've ever seen of Foucault. It's not that he's not a happy guy, but many of the pictures are not quite that joyous. So he died pretty young. As you can see, he was actually just about 57 or 58. And
of age, I think.
He was one of the first sort of very famous people to die of AIDS in 1984.
AIDS. I was right.
Not certainly the first, but one of the first that really came out later about being an AIDS death. And he was someone who was attracted to men and engaged in sexual relationships with men. And he lived with a man for most of his life and was very quiet about this aspect of his life outside of his small circle of friends, but it became much more well known after his death, especially when it turned out that he had died of AIDS. But for his life, he was born and educated and lived most of his time in France, thus the French name. In his youth, he studied history and philosophy, but also psychology and the history of science. So he went to the École Normale Supérieure, a sort of a very prestigious school in France that eventually would produce many university professors, which he became.
And side note, I really wish we could just get rid of this idea of prestigious schools. Like when I was hearing Trump talk about like J.D. Vance would be a great vice president because he went to Yale, and Yale is just amazing. And it's very impressive that he went to Yale, and that he would make a great vice president because he went to Yale. I was like, can we just shut the fuck up about prestigious schools? It is the so-called prestigious schools that have absolutely destroyed our society. It is the so-called prestigious schools where all of the crazy ideas get incubated, and yet still we have people who are buying into this idea of like, you have to go to the right college and university because the more prestigious you go to, the better off you're going to be. No, I actually think the more prestigious school you go through, the more brainwashed you're going to be. And I say that as so I literally got into fucking Dartmouth. I could have gone to a prestigious fucking school. I elected not to because I didn't want to, because I worked in higher education for 10 years. I worked at colleges. I worked for multiple Ivy League schools. I've done consulting for multiple Ivy League schools. I've done consulting for like the shitty colleges. I've done consulting for the for-profit colleges. And I'll tell you this, the for-profit colleges don't have any of this woke shit. And they're actually much better run and much more efficient and much better at actually teaching people. And they get a bad rap because you want to know why? Because the establishment doesn't want people to go to just like an efficiently run school where you just go and you learn the subject matter. They want people going to the so-called elite schools where they're just going to be indoctrinated into bullshit. I saw it happening right in front of me. I worked for a consulting agency for years that was consulting with all sorts of colleges all over the country, everywhere from the for-profits all the way up to the Ivy League schools and everything in between. I saw it right in front of me. The Ivy League schools, the so-called prestigious schools, are some of the worst run schools. They are inefficient. They are interested in bullshit. That's all. They're all interested in like image and branding and like all this bullshit. None of them are actually interested in teaching kids. None of them are actually focused on how do we best articulate the subject matter to our kids. Do you know who is doing that? The fucking for-profits. In fact, when I was working at the consulting agency, there were a lot of nonprofits, like the lower level nonprofits, like the state schools or like the public universities or things like that. They were starting to model themselves after for-profit schools because for-profit schools were so much more efficient at actually delivering just like the basic like value of like a university education. That's reality. And people can laugh at that all they want. Like, oh, for-profit schools are shitty. Well, why do you think that? Why? Well, because some for-profit schools have been scamming kids. Yeah, some for-profit schools did scam kids. They were bad for-profit schools. Guess what? Almost every single college and university scams kids. Almost every single nonprofit scams kids. But they don't get shit on for it because they're a nonprofit, so it must be good. Just because something is a nonprofit, it doesn't make it good. Just because like something being a nonprofit just means that you can't turn a profit. That's literally all it means. It doesn't mean it's well run. It doesn't mean it delivers a quality education. It doesn't mean any of that. And again, I saw this directly. I saw it with my own eyes. There were really big nonprofits that were starting to model themselves after, and that was like 10 years ago. So I worked at that consulting company like 10 years ago. So I would love to just get rid of this whole idea of like like the value of an elite education. Like we just need to stop buying into it. Go to whatever school works best for you, man. Who gives a fuck? Who gives a fuck? But to assume that the elite colleges are somehow better. I mean, the only people who should be doing that are people who have a vested interest in doing that. And anyone should be questioning why do you have an invested interest in propping up these institutions that are literally the birthplaces and the incubators of these ideas that are absolutely destroying our world.
And there he studied philosophy, history of science, and psychology, and his degrees were in philosophy and psychology. Then in his youth, he also was a part of the French Communist Party for a while. So you can kind of get a sense of his politics. He was very left. And he eventually left the French Communist Party for various reasons.
French Communist Party.
To do with something that they lied to him
we're
about.
shocked.
But after his education, he went on to teach in a couple of posts in France as a university professor, as well as in Sweden and then Poland, Warsaw, and then I think also in Germany, Hamburg. And he claims that he left France for Sweden in 1952, so he was still pretty young.
I want to go to Sweden.
He claims that he left France because he was having a hard time with the social conditions in France. He says this in an interview. Freedom for personal life was very sharply restricted there in France. At this time, Sweden was supposed to be a much freer country. And the person who quoted this in one of a biography of Foucault says it's probably a veiled reference to being able to live as a person who sleeps with men. In 1946, there was a law passed in France that only persons of good morality could be employed in the...
Let me see. Plus, fugitive pedagogy is helping the 2025 timeline. Yeah, fugitive. Oh, by the way, sorry, Andrea, I forgot to show the super chat. KB is right. By 2050, illiterate means not illiterate non-listeners. Yeah, for real, bro. For real. And fugitive pedagogy is just the idea of teaching banned ideas in the classroom. That's all that means. And it's going on right now in every state that has an anti-CRT or an anti-woke law. Fun times, fun times. Hey, guys, please make sure you mount the like button for me if you have not already. I'm about to get another Imperial beer. If anyone's drinking anything fun, let us know in the chat. I appreciate you spending your Friday with me learning about Foucault.
Service of the state, including teachers and in schools and universities, which meant that if people knew that you were attracted to and had relations to a same-sex person, you would not be hired as a professor or as a teacher. It turns out that he was able to do so anyway because of various connections that he had, friendships, etc., but officially he was not supposed to do so. In 1949, Paris passes a rule that says it is an offense for men to dance together in any
Foucault
public
was the
place
last
or
thing I said.
establishment open
Foucault,
to the
Michel
public.
Foucault. That's who we're talking
So
about.
these are just examples of things that show you what France was like. It's not as bad as it could have been, but it certainly isn't an open place. But he was in Sweden for a couple of years, and his post ended there, and he was sent to Warsaw to do some teaching. And there he had to leave his post because of a scandal involving a relationship with a man, even though homosexual activities were not illegal in Warsaw at the time. It certainly wasn't something that you were supposed to do as a public official, as a professor and teacher, etc. So he ran into some persecution, not a huge amount during his life, but it did make his life somewhat difficult because of his sexual choices. In 1969, he was elected to what's called still the Collège de France. And this is a very prestigious type of school where what you do is you give a series of lectures every year on what you're researching to the public. They're free, anybody can go, and that's all you have to do every year, and the rest of your time is spent researching. And that's where he spent most of the rest of his life, writing, researching, and giving public lectures.
I want to do that.
So when he would give lectures at the school, and he did so from
I
do
kind of do that. I do kind of do that already. Basically, all I do is I research and then I lecture to the public about, I'm already doing that. I'm already living the dream. Okay, never mind. I've already achieved it.
1984, the rooms were packed. They had to have a second room
a hazy
and pipe
IPA,
the sound
Laura?
in because he was so
good.
popular. And he became an extremely popular intellectual in France who gave many, many interviews on television and radio and in newspapers and magazines. Much of the writing by Foucault that exists is not just in his books, but also in interviews, because there are so many. And now, in the course of the last 10 years or so, almost all of the lectures that he gave at the Collège de France are now published in French, and many of them in English as well. So now there's a whole new set of Foucault's texts that are in existence. In the 1970s, he formed a prisoners' information group. This is part of his political activities, to help prisoners express their own views on what goes on in the French prisons and what needs reforming. So he was interested in making sure that conditions were good for prisoners, and generally had a Marxist outlook and generally a liberal outlook, though he did not fight for gay rights at any time during his life, perhaps to sort of keep that aspect of his personality hidden. And then in 1984, he dies in age 57 of an age-related illness. Not without publishing a huge amount of books, however. This is just one of many, many texts that Foucault has written. Let's take a break. We'll get into the text from there. So let's do about 5 or 6 minutes or so, because I've got a lot to get through in the argument of the text.
Hopefully they just edit that break out. Yes, they did.
Okay, so I'd like to set the stage a little bit for the beginning of the text. Because in the beginning of the text, Foucault says things like, page 6 and 7, page 6, halfway down, first full paragraph. There may be another reason that makes it so gratifying for us to define the relationship between sex and power in terms of repression. If sex is repressed, that is, condemned to prohibition, non-existence, and silence, then the mere fact that one is speaking about it has the appearance of a deliberate transgression. A person who holds forth in such a language places himself to a certain extent outside the reach of power. He upsets the law. And then later, for decades now, we have found it difficult to speak on the subject without striking a different pose. We are conscious of defying established power. Our tone of voice shows that we know we are being subversive, and we ardently conjure away the present and appeal to the future. So there, and on page 7, a little bit on page 8, he's trying to talk about people who speak about sex as if they are thereby transgressing rules. They are thereby being rebellious. They are thereby being revolutionary. And to some degree, he might be referring to things like the liberation movements that were occurring in the 60s and 70s.
Liberation.
And there were lots and lots of liberation movements in North America and in Europe at this time, like women's liberation.
in this case, guys, liberation is probably going to mean liberation from normativity. Normativity being anything that upholds like societal norms. Now, of course, that's always going to go back to capitalism at the end of the day. But I want you to think about like when it comes to like queer theory, their first step is to liberate people from thinking about like societal norms as something that they have any sort of obligation to. They want people to think that everything is socially constructed. Therefore, if something is socially constructed, they can change it into a different social reconstruction, right? And so that's what they're talking about when they say liberation. Sometimes you'll hear references to capitalism within this, but more often it's about normativity, which are the societal norms that uphold capitalism. But they tend to just think about it at a little bit of a lower level place when they're talking about like liberating yourself from like, heteronormative stuff. Does that make sense to everyone? I'm not explaining that very well, but that's kind of the basic gist. I hope that makes sense.
Feminism generally trying to allow women to do more with their lives and be appreciated as equals, like racial concerns, so equal rights, civil rights for
all of this
different
has
races
to do with going back to capitalism, but it's also about normativity.
This particular picture is a gay rights demonstration in New York City in 1976. That was certainly going on at the time. There were also people just generally, if you've heard of, peace and love and free love, sort of free love movements, being people who are thinking that we shouldn't be held down to traditional visions of family and marriage. And might be more like polyamory today, where we should be more free to express our loves and our desires and our pleasures in different ways and not just be held to traditional sorts of institutions. That was pretty big at the time in the 60s and 70s. And just generally, things like being able to have sex with contraception, the development of the birth control pill. Contraception for a while was illegal in many parts of the world up until
contraception and abortion are meant to abolish the gender binary because it liberates women from the oppressive gender roles to which they've been assigned by the socially constructed gender binary.
The 60s or 70s in North America, at least. I don't know about the history in France exactly, but there were a number of, freedom movements, rights movements, equality movements that had to do with sex in one way or another. And so when Foucault says we sometimes speak now of sex in a way that makes it feel like a revolution, in a way that makes it feel like we're transgressing, the rules and the laws, I think these are the kinds of things he's trying to talk about. And since we're not living in 1976 in France, it may be hard to keep that in mind. I had this wonderful picture last time I did this lecture of a bunch of naked people standing in a circle, but it was taken from the back, so I could see where their backsides, all holding up a sign or something that said "free love." And it was this wonderful picture, but it's copyrighted, and I can't put it up here. So. But that's also the idea is this generally free love kind of thing. So that I think is where he's going to when he's talking about how people are thinking about sexuality in 1976. But that also gets us to the repressive hypothesis, and this is why I want to look at the handout and the boxes on the top. I think, though the second one refers to later on in the text, the first chapter is all about the one that's called We Other Victorians. And maybe we can talk in seminar about why it might be called that. That's kind of an interesting title. But that one is all about the repressive hypothesis. And if you get nothing else from this lecture, then get this, because this is the most common problem when people read Foucault. Foucault is not endorsing the repressive hypothesis. Foucault thinks the repressive hypothesis is somewhat problematic.
What is
I want to say he rejects it entirely, but he does criticize it. And sometimes it's hard to get that from the first chapter, because the first chapter he's just talking about it as if it is what we all believe. We think this, we do that. We think sex has been repressed. And then even in the start of the next chapter, he says, so sex has been repressed from the 17th century onwards. So the way he writes can give you the wrong impression. Okay, Foucault says we, meaning generally people around him, believe in the repressive hypothesis, but then he's going to go on to question it. And I've set out 3 parts of the repressive hypothesis on here. And the repressive hypothesis is just a word that he uses to say this is how sex, sexuality, and power have been considered by many people over the past couple centuries. And this is what I think is not quite right. So the first part on the left, since the 17th century, sex has been repressed and silenced by power, reduced to a single permitted form, the heterosexual couple for procreation.
Here it is.
So the usual story, he says, how people tend to think of sex and sexuality over the past few hundred years is that maybe there was some more freedom in sex before the 17th or 18th century, but then the Victorians came around and we stopped talking about it. We stopped thinking about it. It was no longer something that was in the public. It was hidden away. And the only kind of sexuality and sex that was allowed was heterosexual activities precisely for the purpose of procreation. That's one idea about how sex has been treated that Foucault...
The procreation means the maintenance and upholding of capitalism through the nuclear biological family. That's why they were so focused on that. Why is sex for procreation bad? Well, I mean, when you believe that the nuclear family and having sex for procreation inherently upholds our entire system, that's going to be something they want to destabilize and undermine. Does everyone understand that? If you're like the Gripers and you believe that that sex should only happen in marriage and that the purpose of sex is to produce, spawn children, then you are fundamentally holding up the norms that uphold our society. The left socialists, they want to abolish the biological family because they believe that capitalism is reproduced through the nuclear family. And so they are fundamentally opposed to this idea that sex should only take place in marriage and that the purpose of sex is procreation, because if that's all it is, then that means that capitalism is never going to go away and never going to die, because the idea of social reproduction theory is that social systems will reproduce themselves until they are abolished or they're disrupted in some way. So the nuclear family will continue to reproduce capitalism until the nuclear family is disrupted in some way. That's why they're introducing polyamory. That's why they're talking about queer. That's why they're talking about destabilizing these norms. That's why they're introducing birth control. That's why they fight for abortion. That's why they want to destabilize the gender binary. This is where all the attacks on parental rights comes from. If they get rid of parental rights, that's a destabilizing effect on the nuclear family. So that's what people need to pay attention to. Every single thing that is meant... Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting, by the way, that you should believe that sex should only take place in marriage and that it's only between two people and you have to be a virgin until you're married and it's only for... I'm not suggesting you need to believe that. I don't think that's realistic, if I'm honest about it. The fact is, we all live in the real world. And the fact is that the vast majority of us are going to have sex outside of marriage. That's not necessarily bad. The fact is, there are going to be people that don't adhere to this perfect, like, utopian norm of, like, you will meet a person and they will be a virgin and you will fall in love and you will be a virgin too, and you will only be with each other for your entire life and you will never be with... I mean, I guess if people can pull that off, more power to them. I'm not going to judge, but I also think we need to be realistic and we need to live in the real world. As long as you uphold the nuclear family and you're like, you know what? Maybe I want to fuck around. Maybe I don't want to get married. Maybe I want to be in a polyamorous relationship. Maybe I don't believe in monogamy. Maybe I don't want to have kids. I'm not suggesting any of that is bad inherently. What I am suggesting is that you can do the... Like, I don't have kids, but I can acknowledge the importance of the nuclear family. And I can acknowledge the importance of the institution in terms of upholding the norms of society. And just because I'm not acting out that institution doesn't necessarily mean that I don't believe in the legitimacy of it. And it doesn't mean that I'm trying to undermine it. Does everyone understand that? If you want to live that lifestyle, more power to you. But even if you don't, even if you... Like, there are polyamorous people in my community. I know that. There are people that actively have relationships with more than one person, and it's all consensual and everyone knows. And listen, man, I don't care. It's not my business. But as long as you look at the nuclear family and say, yeah, that's an institution that's important to maintain, that's good enough. As long as you're able to recognize that these attacks on the nuclear family are coming at it for a very specific purpose. It's not just to make everyone cry. It's not just to like it's not just to like, it's not just because it feels good. They're doing it for a reason. And if you understand the reason behind it, you can live your life in whatever way you want to and still say, I think it's important that we uphold the nuclear biological family. Does everyone understand that? Let me know if you don't.
Is going to question. And on the right, I've got Foucault's responses to all of these. But I'll just go down to the next part of the repressive hypothesis. Power operates on sex only negatively by prohibiting, rejecting, hindering, and blocking. So what do you mean?
Angel eyes! Hi, comrades. Do you buy a car without at least taking it for a test drive? I mean, this is kind of like my position, Angel eyes. I don't, and listen, this might be controversial. I don't believe in, I think you need to be sexually compatible with the person that you're married to. And I've had enough sex in my life where I know that there are people I'm sexually compatible with and there are people that I'm not sexually compatible with. And though there's nothing inherently wrong with the people that I'm not sexually compatible with, if I had to be married to them, that would suck. Okay? So I'm a big fan of the idea of like, you test drive the car. You need to know if you're sexually compatible with this person. If not, and people who are virgins may not understand this, but like it's real. The struggle is real, okay? If you're going to spend the rest of your life with someone, then you need to make sure that that person can fulfill your needs. And if that person can't fulfill your needs, that is a fucking problem. And it's going to make your marriage miserable. I promise you, you're going to have a much better life if you're having good sex. So that's how I feel about it. But other people disagree with me. And you know what? There is something admirable about the idea of wanting to wait until marriage. I mean, there really is. There's something admirable about that. There's something respectful about that. Like, I get it. But if you make a mistake, that's a mistake you're going to be dealing with for the rest of your life. And I'm sorry. Like, I mean, again, maybe this is selfish. But can you imagine, like, getting married to someone and you're both virgins? And you don't really know what good sex is because you're both virgins. And then you end up, I mean, I suppose maybe you wouldn't know, but like you end up having bad sex for your entire life. You never get to experience good sex. I mean, it's even worse if like one of you is a virgin and one of you isn't. Because maybe that person that's not a virgin, maybe they've experienced good sex and then they get married to someone who's a virgin and it just like, it shits the bed and it's just like, it just doesn't work. But you know what good sex is like and you're like, that's a recipe for an unhappy marriage. That's a recipe for cheating. That's a recipe for infidelity. It's just like, I don't know. Some people might say it's selfish, but I've been married long enough to know that good sex matters. And that's just the way it is. People can disagree. That's fine. Appreciate the super chat.
Means there is people have thought that sex, sexuality have been repressed, hindered, blocked, stopped, put in obstacles in the way by power relationships, whether they be the government, religion.
Hang on. Okay, serious, like real talk. You really need penetration to know if you have good chemistry? Yes. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. You do. Also, again, real talk. Penis size does matter. It just does. And if you are on the smaller end of the spectrum, you need to be able to compensate for that. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying that if you don't have like a big dick, I'm not saying you can't compensate for it, because you absolutely can. But like, your partner needs to know that going into it. It's just reality. And again, like, so is it just about penetration? I mean, maybe, like, not specifically, but these things do matter. I'm sorry. That's just, it's life, man. It's a spectrum. Yep, it's a spectrum. Mhm. Yep. Well, and some people are lucky. Some people are. But if you're not lucky, then I would just feel bad. Some women, I mean, listen, man, if some women like it, then that's their thing too. But you, like, my point is, like, people, like, there are all sorts of different things that people like, right? So, like, you can find a person that likes whatever it is you have. But so I'm not saying there's just like this one type of man or one type of woman that's good for everyone. People like different things, right? People like different things, work. But you need to know that you're going to be marrying someone that gives you those things, or gives you enough of those things where you can be happy. So if there are women who like a smaller penis, okay, fine. But then maybe, like, if they end up marrying someone with a huge giant fucking cock, that's going to be a problem, isn't it? So it goes both ways. Just saying. Yep, too big is also not good. I agree with that. There is such a thing as too big. Yep, I agree. Anyway, I'm just saying. I'm not like whatever you like is fine. Whatever you are is fine. But you need to make sure that you are matched up with a person that likes what you have and that you like what they have. And if there's a mismatch, and then you're married to that person, and then you're with that person for the rest of your life, that's going to be a fucking problem. So I'm just saying, you need to test drive the car. You need to make sure that you like what the other person has, and vice versa. That's it. That's all I'm saying. Yeah, exactly. I'm not talking about me. Okay, all right, fine, bro, fine. All right, this has gone off the rails. Let's continue.
When you can have sex and when you cannot, and where and how, morality, all of those things being part of power that restricts and represses sex. And he then has a response to that as well. And number 3, we should liberate ourselves from repressive power by recognizing, expressing, and acting on our natural and true sexual identities, because repression of these is wrong and harmful. This, to me, sounds like Freud, that repression is something that hurts us, or at least I shouldn't say that entirely, because for Freud, you have to do some repression of some of your unconscious desires and your id in order to exist in the world. But repression can lead to symptomatic developments, hysteria, neurosis. And when it does, you have to lift that repression in some way. You have to be able to accept that part of yourself in some way. So this part of the repressive hypothesis says, instead of allowing power, morality, rules, laws, religion, whatever, to keep us from talking about and acting on our true desires about sex, we should liberate ourselves. We should have a sexual revolution. We should have free love. We should allow people to love who they want to and when and how. And the reason why I say Foucault doesn't completely neglect or reject this hypothesis is because Foucault doesn't think all that stuff is wrong completely. Number 3, he doesn't think, oh, we should definitely keep sex under wraps and hide it and not allow people to act as they choose. He doesn't think that. What he thinks is that this story of how sex has been treated is incomplete. that this is going on. There is some repression of sex. People are not allowed to love who they want and when and how. But that is not all that has been going on about sex. And he wants to bring in another aspect of the story. Okay. Any questions on that so far? Is that sort of the basics of what he's going to respond to? Does that sound like the correct way to think about how sex has been treated over the past history? Do you feel like sex has been repressed and now we are finally liberating ourselves from it? Slowly? You guys are so quiet today. Sure.
It sounds a lot like the way Freud framed investigation. Framed himself kind of like, I'm this hero, this way hero that's going to talk about sex. He's with this young woman.
Yes.
And other people might judge me and say I shouldn't be using these terms with the young woman. I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah. Actually, when Foucault says those things on pages 6 and 7 about how when we talk about sex, we speak as if we are doing something revolutionary, as if we are being rebels, as if we are transgressing the law, and that gives us a sense of power and pleasure. I thought precisely of Freud in Dora, where he says, and I don't have the page number on the top of my head, but he says something like, yeah, that there may be doctors and lay people who will read this and be shocked at what I have talked about with this young girl. But, you know, there's no need to be indignant. I am just doing this in a scientific manner. There is no sexual interest going on. But he certainly does kind of present himself as being, you know, revolutionary. I'm breaking the codes. I'm doing this thing beyond what you're supposed to do. And of course, the whole idea of the repressive hypothesis really fits with what Freud is saying, right? That we have repressed too much of our sexuality. There's nothing wrong with recognizing our incestuous or other desires inside, and we need to pay attention to those and liberate
University
those to some
of British
extent.
Columbia.
Not that he thinks we should act on all of them. Okay, Foucault's overall response, like his general response to this story, this is not the whole story. I just said that. There's more to it than that. Not that it's wrong, but that it's more complicated. And his sort of overall conclusion, which is, I think, one of the hardest things to get in the text, although there are numerous the hard things, trying to liberate ourselves from repression as if we have some sort of true, natural sexual identities. That, of course, remember, for Foucault, sexuality...
It seems as though liberating yourself from repression in this case means that you liberate yourself from the idea that you are obligated to adhere to a social construct, which makes sense.
And these sexual identities are not natural, they're historically constructed. They are things that get implanted in us through a scientific study of sex. So the idea that we have some sort of true and natural ingrained sexual nature is problematic to begin with for Foucault. But trying to liberate that ignores how those identities themselves are produced by a form of power. And it's a form of power he calls biopower. And we'll talk about that as we go on with the lecture today. So I think that's an important thing to get. Not only that sexuality is constructed for Foucault rather than something that's just natural to human beings, that this whole idea that we have a conglomeration of biological, physiological, mental, and activities that you can put together into a package called sexuality, that is a constructed idea.
Will, their idea is that everything is socially constructed, and if everything is socially constructed, that means you can reject it. Essentially, what that means is that the norms of our society in regards to sex, in regards to relationships, in regards to gender, in regards to anything that upholds normative values is socially constructed. And so if the norm of society is socially constructed, that means the norm of society can be rejected. Does that make sense?
The sorts of sexualities that we claim to have, those are constructed. largely through a scientific study of sexuality that it operates through what he calls biopower. So I'm going to try to put all that together in the next little bit before we end. Okay, on the handout, I've got the numbers on the boxes. So when I say RH1, that's repressive hypothesis 1. How does he respond to the idea that sex has been repressed and silenced by power? Well, on the contrary, of course, there has been a discursive explosion, a steady proliferation of discourses concerned with sex. Now, what does that mean? What are discourses? I think in this text, Foucault simply means by discourses things like medicine, pedagogy, political science, demography, so studying demographics, psychology. These are all different ways of talking about and studying phenomena around us. And usually, I think he's calling these sorts of things discourses. So he'll say, there's a medical discourse about sex. There's a psychological discourse about sex. There's a criminological discourse about sex, etc. So we've had lots and lots of different ways of speaking about sex. So it's not that we haven't talked about it. It's that, in fact, he says on page 33, let me find it. End of the first paragraph on page 33. It may well be that we talk about sex more than anything else. We set our minds to the task. We convince ourselves that we have never said enough on the subject, that through inertia or submissiveness, we conceal from ourselves the blinding evidence, and that what is essential always eludes us, so that we must always start out once again in search of it. It's possible that where sex is concerned, the most long-winded, the most impatient of societies is our own. So it's not that sex has only been repressed. And it is true that people have not been able to do perhaps everything that they might want to do in terms of sex. Foucault himself felt a certain amount of repression and silencing of his own sexual desires and activities. So it's not that that isn't happening. But at the same time, there's a huge amount of study of sexuality. Medical, psychological, psychiatric, people studying populations, birth and death rates, criminology, how does sexual behavior relate to crime? There's been many, many discourses that have developed over the last couple centuries about sex. And some of these, he says later on in the text, concern things like children's sexuality and masturbation, onanism, women's hysteria. These are 4 figures of kinds of people that have been studied in particular. The children, women with hysteria, the study and classification of abnormal and perverse sexualities, as well as, he says later on in the text, the couple, the heterosexual couple, and whether they are having enough children, enough right kinds of children, etc. So over the course of the last couple centuries, these things and others have been really intensely studied and carefully focused on. Hysteria we've already looked at to some degree, but there was a lot more discussion of hysteria than just with Freud. The study and classification of abnormal and perverse sexualities, as we'll see in a minute, there were lists, huge lists of perversions, of things that people were doing that was considered a certain kind of sexuality that developed over the course of the last couple centuries, and we still have.
No, I would not say that communists align with simulation theory. I think people are throwing that idea out there in the chat, but like I wouldn't say that that's true. That's not something I've heard.
But today in the DSM-5. So onanism, masturbation, just some examples of how Foucault says this was studied intensely and not ignored. It's not that we ignored this issue of sex, it's that we were really concerned about it. So an anonymous pamphlet in the early 18th century called Onania, or the heinous sin of self-pollution and all its frightful consequences in both sexes considered, with spiritual and physical advice to those who have already injured themselves by this abominable practice. That this was widely circulated, but I'm not sure exactly why it was anonymous, but claimed that what onanism can do is cause illness, among other things, weakness, stunted
I mean, I think we can all believe that, like, can we all agree that, like, destigmatizing masturbation was probably, like, a positive thing? Can we all agree that it was a little fucked up that people thought that they were going to go mentally ill from? I mean, listen, if you're addicted to porn, I guess, and you're just like doing it all the time, like that is actually going to be a problem at some point. But if it's just like normal and it's not detracting from being able to like function in normal society, then it's probably all right.
growth, impotence, hysteria, barrenness, epilepsy, and vaginal
You're not going to
discharge.
get epilepsy.
No, that was not so bad. But many other terrible, terrible things.
Well,
Similarly,
but you can masturbate and still retain your semen. I know there's no reason I should know that, but I do know that. Like, those aren't mutually exclusive. Like, if you could, okay, you're going to have to go somewhere else and learn that. I'm not going to teach that here, but I know that that's true. You can still masturbate I'm just saying, okay, we're going to stop now. Okay, I'm moving on.
It's also 18th century, 1760, Samuel Auguste Tissot, Onanism, dissertation on the maladies produced by masturbation, says, masturbation includes, the problems with it include loss of strength, memory, headaches, blood in the urine, blurred vision, and numerous nervous disorders.
What?
The point is, and Foucault then goes on in parts of his text to say, people were not ignoring children's sexuality. They were very worried about it. They wanted to make sure that children were not doing the things they weren't supposed to do. And there were lots of books and tracts and pamphlets and advice to parents on what to do about the situation and how terrible it could be. I found this wonderful poster from the, I think it's from the probably early 20th century, that I couldn't really fit on a slide, but it had two paths for a boy. One path was where he, it's different ages, and at age 16, he's studying and he's really a nice, normal kid. And at age 20, he's, starting to get a job. At age 35, he has kids and everything's all good on this side. And on this side, what happens to him at age 16 is self-abuse and cigarettes. And then the rest of his life goes downhill. At age 20, he's into crime. At age 35, he's penniless. At age 60, he's dead. It's just because of masturbation, right? And cigarettes. Let's not forget cigarettes. So this was very, very much on people's minds. It was not ignored. Sexual perversions. This is Krafft Ebing, whom Foucault mentions, I think, on page 43. This particular text, Psychopathia Sexualis, is one that has a whole bunch of lists of various perversions. And this is, again, late 19th century, fairly early. He believed, and a lot of people believed at the time, that there is a normal sexual instinct that is heterosexual, that directs your body to who you will be attracted to, male or female, and it can be perverted. It can be taken off track by things such as environmental causes, hereditary problems, you might get it from your parents, or masturbation could also lead you into changing the direction of your sexual instinct towards a perversion. So things like zoophilia, love of animals, homosexuality was considered a perversion, sadism and masochism, pedophilia, etc. These things are still in existence. And Foucault's point is, what's happened over the last 200 years or so? Not that we've ignored sex, but that we've actually started studying it very, very carefully. And we have talked about it a whole lot, and we have developed sciences around it. And now we have created classifications for people about their sexuality. So it has not gone into hiding, it has come out even more. So with that, we've created a scientia sexualis. At least that's one way of pronouncing it in Latin. I don't know why he gives us a Latin term for it instead of just saying a science of sexuality. Interesting, but I just don't know. Because that's basically what it means. We've created sciences around sexuality. And in part, we've done so by using what he calls confessional techniques. And he says, this comes from the practice of Roman Catholic confession. He starts off early in the text saying, well, for a while in confession, you were supposed to confess your sexual acts insofar as they were sinful, right? You don't have to do all of them because some of them are just fine. But later, in 16th century and beyond, the confession starts to focus on your inner thoughts, desires, and fantasies, not only on your activities. He doesn't say why this happens. He just notes it, that pretty soon sex starts to become something more important. Important enough that we need to look into what you're thinking and what you're fantasizing about and what you're dreaming about, not just what you've done. This becomes important later in giving people their identity through sexuality, because sexuality no longer is just a matter of acts. It's a matter of thoughts, feelings, emotions. It's a deeper part of who you are. And Foucault says this starts in confessional practices in Catholicism. And then, though again, he doesn't say how exactly or why, other kinds of discourses, other kinds of practices take on confessional techniques. So things like medicine, psychology, psychoanalysis take on something like a confessional type of technique. You can see it in Freud. And there's this quote on the fronts of the handout. I should have put this on the back, but I was thinking of the lecture a little differently earlier. So on the front of the handout, Freud and Foucault on psychoanalysis as confession. The quote from Freud directly links psychoanalysis as a kind of confessional relationship. Here's the pact that must be established between analyst and patient from Freud. Complete candor on one side and strict discretion on the other. This looks as though we were only aiming at the post of a secular father confessor. But there is a great difference, for what we want to hear from our patient is not only what he knows and conceals from other people. He is to tell us too what he does not know. He is to tell us not only what he can say intentionally and willingly, what will give him relief like a confession, but everything else as well that his self-observation yields him, everything that comes into his head, even if it is disagreeable for him to say it, even if it seems to him unimportant or actually nonsensical. This thus puts us in a position to conjecture his repressed unconscious material and to extend by the information we give him his ego's knowledge of his unconscious. The idea being there that in the situation where you're confessing to a priest, you don't necessarily have to confess everything that's coming up in your head. But for Freud, you do, because what you have to do is say everything that comes to mind, even if it seems nonsensical, even if it seems unrelated, because for Freud, the unconscious will come out in small ways, and you need to have all that information to put it together into a coherent picture. But what's interesting here is that Freud is putting himself in the position of a confessor. And Foucault picks up on this nature of psychoanalysis, that it's a kind of confessional relationship. So let's look quickly at what a confessional relationship looks like. Page 61 at the bottom. Confessional relationship is a ritual that unfolds within a power relationship. For one does not confess without the presence or virtual presence of a partner who is not simply the interlocutor, but the authority who requires the confession, prescribes and appreciates it, and intervenes in order to judge, punish, forgive, console, and reconcile. And he goes on a little bit later too, but just want to focus on that for a moment. That in some ways, the confessional relationship is a power relationship. The person you're confessing to can in a way require your confession, can pull it out from you, is there to judge, to console, or perhaps to heal, as Foucault suggests that Freud is. Freud is someone whom you confess to, not to be forgiven like a priest, but to be healed instead. But Foucault still thinks that's rather similar. And then on page 66, where he's talking about confession turning into something like a scientific practice, there's some places where he talks about Freud directly, even though he doesn't mention him. So number 3 on page 66, if it was necessary to extract the truth of sex through the technique of confession, this was not simply because it was difficult to tell or stricken by the taboos of decency, but because the ways of sex were obscure. It was elusive by nature. And then a little later on, it tended no longer to be concerned solely with what the subject wished to hide, but with what was hidden from himself, being incapable of coming to light except gradually and through the labor of a confession in which the questioner and questioned each had a part to play. The principle of a latency essential to sexuality made it possible to link the forcing of a difficult confession to a scientific practice. So here, this sounds very much like Freud, turning a kind of confession into a science. And then lastly, on the bottom of 66, the work of producing the truth was obliged to pass through this relationship if it was to be scientifically validated. The truth did not reside solely in the subject who, by confessing, would reveal it wholly formed. It was constituted in 2 stages. And later, it was the latter's function to verify this obscure truth. The revelation of confession had to be coupled with the decipherment of what it said. So you needed to have someone that you were confessing to, like Freud, to decipher what you're saying, because to you yourself, it is hidden. It is unconscious. You don't really know what it means. So Foucault's arguing that this practice of confession moved from religion into science, including Freudian psychoanalysis, which is a kind of a confessional relationship. And he goes on to say, the confession has now expressed itself, become something that we have all over in our society. Page 59. We have since become a singularly confessing society. The confession has spread its effects far and wide. It plays a part in justice, medicine, education, family relationships, and love relations. One confesses one's crimes, one's sins, one's thoughts and desires, one's illnesses and troubles. That's an interesting thing to think about for a seminar. To what degree have we become a confessing society? Even though we're not confessing to a religious authority, to what degree do we confess to ourselves and to others? And to what degree do we do that with sexuality? Now, what is all this? Why is all this important? Again, the idea is that we haven't repressed sex. We haven't stopped talking about sex, but we talk about it all the more. We study it scientifically, and we study it scientifically through, in part, practices of confession. Now, Foucault says there's another way we could have approached sex. We do it scientifically. We could have approached it through what he calls an ars erotica, and he hardly says anything about this in the text. But it's almost one other way it could have happened. And so it's worthwhile at least thinking about. There's 2 great procedures for producing the truth of sex. If we're so interested in sex, what could we have done besides study it scientifically? We could have studied sexual pleasure for the sake of intensifying it, multiplying it. He claims that there are practices out there in the world and in history where you focus a lot on sex and sexuality and think about it and study it, but for the sake of making it better, for the sake of increasing pleasure, having the best pleasure possible. That's not what most of our scientific study of sexuality is about. Most of ours is about figuring out what's normal, what's abnormal, what's healthy and unhealthy, what can cause you problems. There's a little less scientific study about, although there has been some, about just what to do to increase your pleasure as much as possible. And Foucault's like, well, that would have been an interesting way to study sex, but we didn't go there. Instead, what we tend to do is we were seeking the truth about sexuality in order to create a scientific knowledge that categorizes
honestly,
individuals
like, why not?
So that we will say, like in the DSM-5, there are these kinds of sexualities that are abnormal.
I mean, there is like a point to be made about like, wouldn't people be fundamentally happier if they were more sexually fulfilled? I mean, honestly, I feel like a lot of the problems people get into around sex is like they're repressing what they want. They're not expressing their desires in like a healthy way. And that's when all the problems start, when you're repressing yourself, when you're like, I mean, wouldn't the world generally be a happier place if people could just, you know, feel as good as they want to feel in the privacy of their home, in the confine. I mean, like, there really is something to be said about this. I really think that like half of the problems that conservatives have is that they just repress themselves sexually, and they claim they don't because they're like, oh, you don't know what we do. I'm like, you know, I know that you guys are really uppity about sex. It's like, we are human beings at the end of the day. We all have bodies. We all have, it's a thing, right? And so if you're repressing what you want, if you're not finding a way to like healthily and productively like express what you want, that's going to create problems for you. And it's going to get you addicted to porn, and it's going to make you have unhealthy sexual habits and like all that stuff. Can't we just dispense with that and say like, you know, maybe we should just figure out a way to make things better for everyone?
That are disorders insofar as they cause people distress. And then there's other practices that are normal. There are, you know, homosexuality and heterosexuality now are finally becoming more normal, right? But there are some sexualities that are still considered abnormal, that we do tend to think about classifying people in terms of what's permitted, what's normal, what's strange. And that's what we do with our science of sex. Okay, response to repressive hypothesis number 2. Power operates on sex only negatively by prohibiting, rejecting, hindering, and blocking it. All right, the thought here is, yeah, there have been some power relationships, there's been some laws, there's been some pressures from morality or religion or rules in families and schools that say what you can't do. And we do tend to sometimes think of power in terms of rules and laws that negate, prohibit some actions and allow others. So we often tend to think of what power is something along the lines of a government or a state or an institution.
Hang on, we got a super chat from Rottweiler. There's another failure of conservatives, the repression of sex, refusal to talk about it, causing their kids to be drawn to queer activism while calling all others coomers for being more. Yeah, I mean, that's like the thing. It's like the quickest way to get your kids to engage in some really weird shit is to tell them, no, you can't go over there. This is why the book banning thing was always so stupid. Because no one actually cared about reading that genderqueer book. Like, you know, there weren't kids lining up to check out the genderqueer book from the library until all their parents started talking about banning it, and they were going to school board meetings about it, they were complaining about it. And it's like, the minute that you try to ban something, kids are like, what's going on? Why can't I read that thing? What don't you want me to see? And then they go and they figure out how to find it anyway, or they go, a friend gets an illicit copy of the genderqueer book and they read it that way. It didn't even need to be in the library in the first place. This is why the book banning thing was like one of the stupidest things conservatives have ever done. But, you know, I guess we should not expect anything differently.
Institution that has rules, and those rules tell you what you can and can't do. So there are rules that say you must not do this, but you can do that. And you get that from your state, you get that from your institution. UBC has rules of what you can and can't do. And many of these rules are negative. You must not do this, you must not do this, you must not do this, although there are some positive ones too. But Foucault says on 83 and 85, that's how we tend to think of power generally, as just a set of rules that are enforced by officials, you know, by police or administrators in the school or by your boss or your parents. And they stop you from doing certain things. That is a common way of thinking of power. And in terms of sex, what this would mean is, where sex and pleasure are concerned, power can do nothing but say no, meaning this is the repressive view of sex. That if you just think of power as something that blocks, stops, rules that tell you what you can't do, then your idea of what power does to sex is just going to be to say no. There's only certain things you can do with sex. Everything else, I'm going to say you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. But he thinks there's a new form of power that's developed over the past few years, past few hundred years, I should say, that works to promote and manage life through regulating and managing sex rather than prohibiting it. And this is a subtle distinction, the idea of using power to monitor what's going on with sex and to manage what's going on with sex rather than ignoring it or prohibiting it. And that's what he thinks is happening with all this science of sex. And we're trying to figure out what's going on with it. What are people doing? What are people thinking? What are people feeling? What are their fantasies, their dreams, their desires? Now, let's put them into categories. You are this, and you are that, and you are that. And let's see what's happening with our society in terms of sex. Who's normal? Who's abnormal? Is there anything dangerous going on? And that's managing sex rather than not talking about it, being silencing, or prohibiting things that are considered wrong or bad. And part of what Foucault is saying here is, look, it's not that we are just ignoring those things that people think shouldn't be done. We're not just trying to put away masturbation or put away perversions or put away pedophilia and say, don't do those things. Those things have been the study of multiple discourses and studies and sciences so that they can be better managed rather than prohibited. Okay, so as I guess I just said this, the new form of biopower, sex is something to be managed and controlled, regulated by medical and social sciences, public health authorities, rather than prohibited. So for example, on page 24, yeah, towards the bottom. One had to speak of it, sex, as a thing to be not simply condemned or tolerated, but managed, inserted into systems of utility, regulated for the greater good of all, made to function according to an optimum.
You went to Dollywood? I hope you had a great time.
Sex was not something one simply judged, it was a thing one administered. It was in the nature of a public potential. It called for management procedures. Now, in a way, though I think this is subtle, Foucault may be saying, you know, it's one thing to just say, let's ignore sex and let's repress the kinds of things that we think are wrong about sex. Let's only talk about heterosexuality and procreation. It's one thing to sort of leave that other stuff off to the side and let it be and try to ignore it. It's quite another thing to spend a lot of time studying it and managing it and controlling it and surveying it, which actually could be thought of as power becoming even more ingrained in people, right? Now we are the subject of very deep study and control insofar as we are told we have certain sexualities. You're going to be put into this category. You're going to be considered normal or abnormal, etc. And so in a way, it's actually even deeper of a problem. Okay, quickly, two ways he thinks about this kind of biopower. One is in, just relationship to what he calls sovereign power at the end of the text. And this is a kind of a confusing distinction, but at the end of the text, he says in the last chapter, there's something called sovereign power. And though there's many aspects of what he means by sovereign power, the one thing he's focusing on here is its relationship to life. And it has a particular relationship to life. The kind of power he calls sovereign is the sort of thing you might think of with a monarchy or something like with Hobbes. The sovereign power is one that has the right to make, die, or let live. And all he means by this is sovereign power is the kind that has the right to take away the life of the citizens through capital punishment, through sending them to war, or even deep harm, deep injury as a matter of punishment. But sovereign power is not the kind that invests a lot of energy in trying to manage the life of the citizens, in trying to enhance their life, to make their health better. It's the only thing it does with life is kill people or let them live. That's the way Foucault puts it. And I was looking back at Hobbes, and I was looking at all the things that the sovereign can do in Hobbes, and none of it has to do with let's make life better. Let's talk about the health of the citizenship. Let's manage their sexuality. Let's see what the birth and death rate is, all this stuff that biopower is going to be about. Hobbes doesn't talk about that. Hobbes talks about what the sovereign can do in terms of punishing you, making laws. He can take away your life. And I think maybe you could think of Hobbes as a kind of sovereign power. But biopower is the power to make life or let live. And this is just the way he puts it in a slightly different text. Biopower, he says on page 136, is bent on generating forces, making them grow and ordering them rather than impeding them or making them submit. Better quote on 137. It's a power that exerts a positive influence on life, that endeavors to administer, optimize, and multiply it. Biopower is when a state or an institution tries to intervene in people's lives to make them flourish, to make their health better, to think about what's going on with the population in terms of life, birth rates, disease rates, death rates. All those things that might fall under population health would fall under biopower. So I have, I think, here examples, yay. So studying birth and death rates to determine how your population is doing in terms of its life, you know, how long are people living, how many kids are being born, distribution of diseases, how they spread, how many diseases we have, health issues related to living and working conditions. These things would be examples of how a state or an institution,
a capitalist state,
or a society might practice biopower.
Yep, biopower.
And it's different than a state that just is worried about, you know, you guys can live however you want to, but I, as the sovereign, I'm going to make sure you follow these rules or I'm going to punish you. This is a state that really carefully looks into its citizens' lives, that worries about their sex, because that has to do with the birth and death rate. That has to do with the rate of disease. That has to do with the general health of the population. And you can start to see how and why Foucault starts to mention things like racism towards the end of the text, state-controlled racism, and Nazism.
Oh!
Because this can lead directly into the idea that we have to be very careful about the health of the race and about our population and make sure our kind of people have the right kind of health, and that we are having enough children of our kind of people, and that the other kind of people are not having too many children to overrun our state. These sorts of practices are precisely what's needed for something
which is
like
against
eugenics
what the left wants.
and state racism. But other examples of biopower we have now, determining when and how often women need to have mammograms. That's, you know, we still do that. So let's just figure out what's going to be good for our population in terms of their health. Vaccination programs, free vaccinations. This is a public health issue. Vision and hearing screening for children. Look, none of this is a bad thing, right? These are useful things for making sure the population is healthier. All that Foucault is saying is, it also means that we are being studied more and more, and our sex is being studied more and more. And vaccination programs and all that, it doesn't have anything to do with sex. But a lot of our sexual lives are being studied more and more and controlled and managed by the state for the sake of population health and other concerns about the state and its people, and that it could be problematic. Okay, quickly. Last thing, we should liberate ourselves from oppressive power by recognizing, expressing, and acting on our natural and true sexual identities. So remember again, there is no natural and true sexual identity. It's created through all this study of sexuality scientifically. That physiology, emotions, desires, and pleasures can be linked to sexuality is constructed by practices of biopower. That we think we have a particular sexuality is constructed by all of these sciences that have developed over the course of a number of years. And we still have those sciences today telling us what different kinds of sexualities are. And sexuality then becomes a principle of classifying individuals. And we think of ourselves as having that. I think of myself as this type of sexual being because I have been told that's what I am, not by any particular person, but by looking around at what that kind of sexual being means, I then take on that identity. This will connect with hacking for next week. We cannot liberate ourselves from repression or calls to liberate sexuality from repression support the operations of biopower. So if we think we are just going to liberate our natural sexuality from those who would tell us not to express it, that encourages us to think we have a natural sexuality, that we have this secret inside of us that needs to be expressed, which Foucault is questioning. And this supports confessional practices that allow sexuality to be studied, monitored, and managed. If we think we should talk about it more because it's a secret that has been repressed, that's precisely what's needed to study it, control it, and manage it. We need to be a confessing society so that we can learn more about sexuality so that it can be managed. And I'm going to zip through this quickly. I will post these on web. So I'm sorry if you missed this one, because I want to get to the last quote from Foucault, which actually is on the handout. Last quote on the handout, and then we can leave. Sorry, just a couple minutes over. Foucault's only suggestion of something different than what we have right now is in this sort of statement, which he says a couple of places. There's a problem when people think they have to uncover their own identity and that their own identity has to become the law, the principle, the code of their existence. If the perennial question they ask is, does this thing conform to my identity? The notion of sexual identity has been very useful, but it limits us. And I think we can and have a right to be free. And then later, sexuality is something that we ourselves create. It is our own creation and much more than the discovery of a secret side of our desires. Sex is not a fatality, it's a possibility for a creative life. So rather than thinking we have to uncover some truth about our sexuality inside of us, recognize it's a creation, we can create it how we want to. And this is an emphasis of freedom that he gives. Not in this book, but elsewhere. Okay, managed to make it all the way through, so thank you.
All right. We made it through the Foucault lecture, guys. Congratulations if you made it to the very end. Now, listen, that was definitely not the most spicy lecture we've ever listened to, but I'm actually happy we listened to it because at least now we have some grounding when we're talking about Foucault. We've listened to Butler before. We never really listened to Foucault stuff before. And so I'm glad we did it. It was an interesting exercise, but a little bit of a lackluster day, if I'm honest about it. I mean, it's kind of the same old, but now we can say that we've been there and done that, and that's important. Anyway, it's really all I have. So what we will do is we will regroup tomorrow for Socialism Saturday at 6 p.m. and we will watch some real socialism. I'm going to figure out a good, nice socialist thing for us to watch, and we will drink some more beer and we will enjoy ourselves. And it's it's checked off the list. Exactly. We checked it off. We did it. We can move on now. I appreciate you guys. I hope you have a great rest of your Friday. I kind of have an inclination to stream again tonight, but I also kind of don't have an inclination to stream again tonight. So I'm not going to promise I'm going to stream again tonight. I'm just going to say that maybe, possibly, I might have an inclination, but don't change your plans or anything. If you're around, you're around. If you're not, you're not. I probably will just do nothing and just continue to drink and maybe watch a movie. That might be something I do too. Anyway, I'll be back tomorrow for Socialism Saturday at least. But take care, guys. We'll see you soon. Bye.